There was a hum, almost imperceptible at first, that slipped between the ordinary sounds of the night, a low vibration threading its way through static, a signal that seemed to exist without origin. To the untrained ear, it was nothing more than interference, the faint crackle of forgotten frequencies bouncing across the ether. But for 22 people scattered across towns, cities, and even remote hamlets, that hum carried something else. It whispered, not words at first, but a cadence, a rhythm that prickled the skin and tugged at the corners of thought, urging them to listen closer, to wonder, to question. And when they did, when they leaned into the impossible clarity hidden within the distortion, they stepped across a line, a threshold beyond which curiosity would become something more, a quiet, insidious danger. It began innocently enough, as most dangerous things do. A researcher tinkering with equipment late at night, a recluse scanning airwaves for signals of forgotten frequencies, a student looking for the thrill of the unusual, each found the same anomaly, as if fate or some unseen hand had threaded their lives together. The signal seemed to recognize them, subtly adjusting, responding to attention, as though it had existed solely to be discovered. And when they pressed record, or leaned in closer to hear the voice buried beneath the static, they felt it, a peculiar mix of awe and apprehension, a deep understanding that they were listening to something they were never meant to understand. Who sent it? That question came first, naturally. Could it be a prank, a rogue broadcast, an experiment lost to time? They considered these possibilities, but intuition whispered otherwise. The signal had a weight to it, a strange gravity. Each stuttered syllable seemed deliberate, as if shaped by intention rather than chance. It was a puzzle, yes, but one that did not merely tease the intellect. It reached deeper, nudging at something primal. There around them felt thinner when they listened. The nights grew colder. Shadows seemed to linger longer than they should. They began to notice things. A door slightly ajar, footsteps that stopped when they turned to look, the sensation of eyes watching from corners where no one stood. Slowly, inexorably, the signal became more than a curiosity. For each listener, it threaded its way into thought, into dreams, into the quiet moments between one heartbeat and the next. It asked questions that they did not consciously hear but somehow understood. What do you truly know? How far are you willing to go for understanding? What happens when what you learn cannot be unlearned? With each night spent listening, they crossed a line they did not see, until even their waking moments were colored by the hum of the signal and the insistent pull of its unknown purpose. And then came the moment they realized there was no turning back. Knowledge, once acquired, has a peculiar permanence. It cannot be erased, cannot be locked away. The 22 discovered that each fragment of the broadcast carried consequences, small, subtle, almost imperceptible at first. Objects misplaced, memories slipping like water through their fingers, a sense of déjà vu that grew heavier with each passing day. Friends began to notice changes in them, though not always in ways that could be named. The line between reality and the influence of the signal blurred, leaving a faint but persistent unease that lingered like fog. And still the hum called to them. Yet it was not all fear, there was also wonder, an irresistible allure that reminded them of the first time they glimpsed the impossible as children, standing on a hilltop at night, watching a firefly hover, or seeing the first light of dawn stretch across the horizon. This broadcast offered that same fleeting awe, a glimpse of something larger, something that hinted at truths beyond ordinary comprehension. It promised answers while concealing the cost. And the 22, pulled equally by curiosity and the quiet thrill of forbidden knowledge, leaned in further, never suspecting the subtle psychological unraveling that awaited. What is the price of listening too closely, of seeing too much? This question, while abstract at first, soon became painfully concrete. Some of the 22 awoke in the middle of the night to find notes scrawled in handwriting that was not theirs, containing fragments of information they could not remember hearing. Others began to speak aloud in ways that seemed guided by the signal itself, words forming from their lips that startled even themselves. Sleep became uneasy, thoughts twisted in directions that were alien and unwelcome, and yet irresistible. It was as though the broadcast reached into the deepest corners of mind and memory, rearranging the familiar into the uncanny, the safe into the inexplicable. And through it all, the hum persisted. A reminder, a lure, a warning that knowledge, once sought, becomes a living thing. It does not stay dormant. It does not remain politely confined to pages or recordings. It grows, it spreads, it ripples outward, touching everything in its path. Those who listened began to wonder, was it they who were discovering the broadcast, or was the broadcast discovering them? Were they in control, or were they already ensnared, caught in a web of sound and meaning that had existed long before their ears had stumbled upon it? As the nights lengthened, and the 22 became more attuned to the rhythms of the signal, the subtle psychological unraveling became harder to ignore. They noticed the quiet disappearance of certainty, the sense that nothing could ever be taken at face value again. Reality itself seemed to flicker, like an old film reel with glimpses of patterns that were never meant to be seen, hints of knowledge too dangerous to articulate, and the heavy, almost tangible weight of secrets. They had learned too much, and learning, they would soon realize, could be fatal in ways no one had anticipated. So the question remains, and it lingers in the listener's mind as they settle into the quiet of night. Can curiosity ever be contained, or does it always ripple outward, touching minds and fates that were never meant to intersect? Can a single broadcast, a single fragment of knowledge, unravel the world in subtle, untraceable ways? And most haunting of all, if you were listening now, would you hear it too? Or would you, like the 22, be drawn into a story from which there is no easy return, a hum beneath the silence whispering truths you may not yet be ready to confront? The hum waits, and so do they. It began in the quietest hours of the night, a soft static weaving its way through the empty spaces of homes, apartments, and offices where no one expected anything at all. At first, it was just a faint hum, an almost imperceptible vibration that trembled at the edges of hearing, like the faint echo of a memory one could not quite recall. But for a few, a very few, this hum was not mere background noise. It carried a pull, an almost magnetic insistence that demanded attention. And when they leaned closer, tuning their receivers or adjusting dials on old radios, the hum began to resolve into something that defied logic. A signal, irregular, static-filled, almost unintelligible, yet somehow compelling. It was as if the sound itself was alive, coiling through the wires and airwaves, seeking out ears that were ready or perhaps destined to hear. The earliest listeners noticed a peculiar rhythm, a cadence that hinted at language but resisted comprehension. It was not simply words. It was a texture of sound that conveyed urgency, secrets, and the weight of unseen knowledge. One researcher, working alone in a basement cluttered with equipment, described it as a pulse beneath the pulse of the world, something that made the hair at the back of the neck rise, something that set a heartbeat slightly off kilter. Others felt it in their chests, in the deep hollow behind their sternum, a vibration they could not ignore, a signal that suggested both invitation and warning. And though they did not yet understand what it meant, each felt compelled to record it, to analyze it, to listen once more. What made the signal unsettling, perhaps, was not its strangeness alone, but the subtle sense that it knew them. There were fluctuations that seemed too precise, patterns too deliberate to be random. One night, the researcher noticed that when he adjusted the frequency, the static would shift almost immediately, almost as if it responded to his touch. At another time, the broadcast would crescendo at a precise moment, just as he leaned back from the receiver in weary disinterest, forcing him to sit forward again. These were not accidental coincidences. The signal was attentive, patient, and disconcertingly intelligent. It waited in the spaces between thoughts, in the long silences of night, weaving a web that was invisible yet increasingly irresistible. The 22 individuals who would become enmeshed in this strange broadcast came from very different places, each unaware of the other's existence. Some were academics, poring over decades-old research and tinkering with forgotten frequencies. Others were hobbyists, radio enthusiasts who chased signals for the thrill of discovery, for the quiet joy of the unusual. A few stumbled upon the transmission entirely by accident, a scanner left on overnight, a curiosity that could not resist the faint crackle in the ether. And yet, despite the differences in their circumstances, their experiences began to mirror one another. The signal did not simply speak to them, it resonated with them. It echoed the unspoken questions of the mind, tugged at dormant fears, and highlighted curiosities they had never acknowledged. With each night spent listening, subtle changes began to appear. The first were small, easily dismissible. A misplaced object, a forgotten appointment, a fleeting sense of déjà vu. But then the disturbances grew more pointed. Dreams became vivid in ways that unsettled them, filled with imagery that seemed drawn from the signal itself, flashes of shapes, and faces that vanished upon waking, symbols they could not name yet recognized as familiar. Some began to hear whispers beneath the static, fleeting syllables that were gone if they tried to repeat them. It was as if the broadcast reached into the mind, bypassing conscious understanding, planting seeds that grew quietly in shadowed corners of perception. The very nature of the signal was uncanny. Unlike ordinary broadcasts, it could not be pinned to a single origin. Attempts to trace it led to dead ends, to frequencies that did not exist, to echoes of sound that seemed to vanish. When examined closely, amateur radio operators reported it flickering in and out, appearing only when attention lapsed, then vanishing the moment instruments were aimed with deliberate focus. Its static seemed to contain a hidden rhythm, a code perhaps, though one that resisted all conventional attempts at deciphering. It was alluring precisely because it was unknowable. The tension of the unknown drew listeners further into its orbit, binding them with a mixture of fascination and unease. And the broadcast was not uniform in its effect. Each person experienced it differently, as though it sensed their deepest curiosities or anxieties, and tailored its influence accordingly. Some felt exhilaration, an almost childlike wonder at glimpsing a secret world behind the fabric of reality. Others felt dread, a quiet, gnawing sense that the knowledge they were receiving could unravel the very boundaries of what they understood to be true. It was both invitation and warning, and while no one could articulate why, there was a shared, unspoken understanding. This was no ordinary signal, and the knowledge it carried was not intended for ordinary minds. The signal's pull was patient but relentless. Listeners found themselves returning night after night, not out of habit, but as if drawn by invisible threads they could not resist. Even when they tried to stop, even when fear began to creep in, they discovered themselves tuning in again, compelled by the unnameable promise of the broadcast. Each session left them changed, a subtle shift in perception that could not be undone. Some noticed that ordinary conversations seemed dull, that everyday events lacked the intensity of the moments spent with the signal. It became the axis around which their awareness turned, a quiet obsession wrapped in the guise of curiosity. The 22 slowly began documenting their experiences. Journals, audio logs, and private notes revealed shared patterns, lapses in memory, sudden insights, a creeping sensation that their understanding of reality was being rewritten. Thought they had not yet met, their experiences converged along uncanny lines. Names, dates, and locations began to intersect in subtle ways, and some of the earliest recordings hinted at coincidences that defied probability. It was as if the broadcast had sewn together threads from multiple lives, tying them into a larger narrative that they could not yet perceive in full. Yet despite the unease, or perhaps because of it, there was a beauty to the experience. It was as if the broadcast existed in a twilight space between comprehension and mystery, offering glimpses of vast hidden structures in the world while leaving much deliberately obscured. It teased the mind with riddles too complex to solve, painted visions that faded when approached, and filled the quiet hours of night with both wonder and terror. Those who listened felt both smaller and larger at once, insignificant in the grand design, yet connected to something ineffable and eternal. And as the night stretched on, the realization grew heavier. Knowledge, once received, could not be returned. The 22 had stepped across a threshold, and with each return to the broadcast, they drew closer to a point of no return. The signal was more than sound. It was a presence, an intelligence that measured not by logic, but by attention, curiosity, and desire. And it waited patiently, inexorably, to see what each of them would do, how far they would go, and what they would risk for a glimpse of truths too dangerous to be fully known. So in the hush of night, amid the static and the hum, the first threads of an extraordinary story began to form. The 22 were no longer simply listeners. They were participants, unknowingly entangled in a web of hidden knowledge, a broadcast that should not exist, and a mystery that would come to shape their minds, their choices, and their very lives. And as the signal pulsed gently beneath the quiet, a single, unavoidable question arose for anyone who heard it. What happens when you learn too much, and the world you knew can never be trusted again? After the first nights of listening, the 22 began to notice things that were impossible to explain, small anomalies in their everyday lives that suggested the signal had seeped beyond the confines of the radio or scanner. At first, it was subtle, a fleeting memory of a conversation that had never occurred, an inexplicable feeling of being watched even in empty rooms, the sense that time had folded in on itself in ways they could not name. It was in the quiet moments, when the world seemed to pause between heartbeats, that the broadcast whispered its presence most insistently. And slowly, imperceptibly, it began to shape them, molding their perceptions, nudging their thoughts, awakening a curiosity they could no longer resist. Dreams became the first undeniable sign that the signal had moved beyond the airwaves. For some they were vivid, cinematic sequences that left a lingering sense of awe upon waking. Faces appeared in these dreams that had never been seen, landscapes that could not exist, and events that made no sense in the context of ordinary life. Yet there was a clarity, a precision in the dream world that demanded attention. One listener awoke from such a vision convinced that the movements of the dream had been a kind of language, a pattern to be understood, though it could not be recalled fully when the eyes opened. Another described hearing echoes of the static within the dream itself, weaving around unfamiliar voices, forming a kind of rhythm that both fascinated and unsettled. It was as if the signal had found a bridge into the most intimate parts of the mind, a passageway that bypassed conscious thought entirely. Alongside dreams came compulsions, small but insistent urges that seemed to arrive without cause. Some felt drawn to certain locations at odd hours, compelled to wander streets, parks, or abandoned buildings without knowing why. Others were overcome with the desire to record, to write, or to analyze fragments of data they could not fully interpret. Attempts to resist these compulsions were met with a Nunazi tension, a restless energy that could only be relieved by yielding. And when they did, they felt a fleeting satisfaction, a momentary sense of alignment with the hidden rhythm of the broadcast. It was seductive in a way that was difficult to articulate. The more they obeyed its subtle commands, the more intimately they became entwined with the signal's quiet intelligence. Coincidences began to accumulate too, in ways that defied casual explanation. Objects would appear where they had not been placed, notes or messages seemed to anticipate questions, and fragments of conversation would echo phrases from the broadcasts, as though the world itself were beginning to mirror the signal's cadence. Some of the 22 began to record these coincidences in journals, documenting patterns that were at once specific and ineffable. Others tried to rationalize them, attributing the phenomena to fatigue, imagination, or coincidence itself. But the persistence of these events, coupled with the quiet pull of the broadcast, made denial increasingly impossible. They could not escape. The sense that they were being observed, or perhaps gently guided, by forces beyond their comprehension. Daily life, too, became a theater in which the signal performed its subtle manipulations. Tasks once mundane took on a strange, almost ceremonial quality. The act of pouring tea, walking along a sidewalk, or opening a window became a moment pregnant with tension, as though the world had shifted slightly out of alignment. One listener described the sensation as a quiet vibration beneath the ordinary, a feeling that the air itself carried messages meant only for those attuned to the broadcast. Another noticed that conversations with friends and family sometimes felt like echoes of dialogue from the static, their words carrying a resonance that suggested deeper meaning. The boundary between the broadcast and reality was dissolving, imperceptibly, but irreversibly. As days passed, the 22 also began to experience moments of heightened awareness, fleeting flashes of insight that seemed to arrive fully formed from nowhere. A pattern in the stars might suddenly suggest a connection with a fragment of the signal. A word overheard in passing could trigger a memory of static that had haunted a dream the previous night. These insights were intoxicating, offering a sense of clarity, but they carried with them an undercurrent of unease. For each revelation hinted at more profound knowledge that might be too vast, too intricate, or too dangerous to fully grasp. And yet, the allure of understanding proved irresistible. It drew the listeners back to the hum night after night, binding them ever more tightly to the invisible threads of the broadcast. Emotions became more fragile under the influence of the signal. Moments of wonder were tempered with fear or shadowed by doubt. The 22 found themselves questioning not only what they had heard, but who they were in relation to it. They noticed subtle shifts in perception, colors appearing unusually vivid, sounds carrying hidden undertones, ordinary objects seeming to pulse with significance. And in quiet, reflective moments, a disquieting question would surface. Were they noticing these things because they existed, or because the broadcast had made them see what was never meant to be seen? This uncertainty carried a weight that was both thrilling and exhausting, a tension that could not be resolved through logic alone. Thessalation imposed by the signal was another subtle effect. Even when surrounded by others, listeners felt as though they inhabited a private reality, a layer of existence that only they could perceive. Attempts to share experiences often met with confusion or dismissal from those untouched by the broadcast. In response, the 22 turned inward, forming a tentative, unspoken kinship through shared awareness of the signal's reach. It was a solitary community, bound not by geography or conversation, but by the unspoken acknowledgement of a force that was both alluring and dangerous. Physical sensations also accompanied the growing psychological influence. Some felt a tingling at the base of the skull when the static reached certain frequencies, a warmth or chill that spread unpredictably across the skin. Others reported moments of vertigo, a sensation of being slightly untethered from the body, as though the signal tugged at perception itself. Though subtle, these experiences heightened the sense that the broadcast was more than sound. It was a presence, one that reached beyond mere waves and into the very fabric of consciousness. And yet, even as unease mounted, the compulsion to listen, turn night after night, intensified. Perhaps most striking of all was the signal's ability to evoke memory and longing simultaneously. A note buried in static might trigger a recollection long forgotten, a childhood event, a conversation, a fleeting emotion. Yet these memories were never entirely faithful. They shimmered with distortion, like reflections in water, reminding the listener that the broadcast was shaping the mind as much as it was responding to it. Every encounter carried duality, wonder and fear, clarity and confusion, intimacy and isolation. The signal became a mirror, reflecting desires and anxieties back at the listeners with gentle, unerring precision. In this slow accumulation of effects, the 22 were transformed. What began as curiosity evolved into a subtle obsession, a state of constant alertness tempered by moments of awe. Ordinary life became secondary to the rhythm of the broadcast, which continued to weave itself into dreams, compulsions, coincidences, and fleeting insights. And in the quiet hours, when the hum of the signal pulsed softly beneath thought, they realized that their understanding of reality had shifted irrevocably. The broadcast had become a part of them, inseparable and insistent, and they could not imagine stepping away from its call, even if they wished to. By the time the first full month had passed, the 22 were no longer simply listeners. They were participants in a dialogue they did not fully understand, a conversation that occurred across the boundaries of consciousness and perception. And though they had yet to meet or speak with one another, their experiences converged along invisible lines, forming patterns that none could yet articulate. The signal, patient and enigmatic, continued to hum, a constant companion in the quiet spaces of night, carrying the promise of knowledge and the weight of its consequences, slowly shaping those who had chosen to hear it and leaving them poised at the threshold of mysteries they were only beginning to glimpse. It was not the first time they had followed the signal's pull into unusual spaces, but this time the journey felt different, as though the very air around them was conspiring to guide them somewhere unseen, somewhere that had always existed, beyond the ordinary gaze. For one of the 22, a researcher whose nights had been consumed by the hum and static, it began with an old map discovered tucked into a stack of forgotten documents in a university archive. The paper was yellowed, edges frayed, annotated with a series of coordinates that seemed to correspond almost perfectly with the fluctuations of the broadcast. At first he dismissed it as coincidence or prank, but a subtle insistence, an internal tug that had grown stronger with every night of listening, urged him to follow the trail. And so, alone under the dim glow of a lantern, he ventured into streets and alleys that had long been abandoned toward a building that, to the casual observer, seemed nothing more than a derelict husk of past industry. The building itself seemed to resist attention, shrouded in shadow, its windows darkened and smeared with decades of neglect. There was a weight to its silence, the kind of stillness that presses against the skin and lingers in the ears, making every footstep echo in unnatural ways. As he stepped through the creaking doorway, the first thing he noticed was the smell, a mixture of dust, rust, and the faint tang of something chemical, almost electrical, that hinted at unseen machinery. Light from his lantern flickered against walls lined with panels, wires, and sockets, their surfaces coated with the patina of abandonment. There was nothing overtly threatening here, yet the room carried an atmosphere of anticipation, a sense that eyes, though unseen, were observing, waiting. The hum of the broadcast seemed to grow louder here, threading itself into the rhythm of his pulse. It was no longer distant. It filled the space around him, vibrating through the floorboards, the walls, and the very air. Machines that had long been silent seemed to awaken at his presence. Switches clicked faintly, coils buzzed, and meters flickered with indecipherable readings. Shadows shifted in ways that defied expectation, cast by lights he could not locate, flickering across surfaces that were otherwise featureless. It was as if the room itself was sentient, aware of the human who had trespassed into its quiet dominion, calibrating its presence to the observer. In a corner, a desk lay buried under stacks of yellowed papers, notebooks, and reel-to-reel tapes. The notebooks contained meticulous annotations, fragments of formulas, symbols, and dates that corresponded with the strange times the broadcast had appeared on air. Some notes were in familiar handwriting, others cryptic, belonging to individuals whose identities were untraceable. It became clear to him that this room had been a hub of observation, a place where someone, perhaps many someones, had studied not only the signal, but the minds of those who heard it. The realization sent a chill down his spine. This was not merely an abandoned building. It was a room built for watching, recording, and cataloging human response, a place designed to see the invisible, to measure the imperceptible. He walked further into the chamber, each step echoing with precision, the sound magnified by the high ceilings and barren walls. Above him, exposed conduits and cables ran like veins, humming faintly with residual energy. Occasionally, a panel of lights blinked to life, illuminating instruments whose functions were inscrutable, dials spinning without pattern, oscilloscopes dancing in erratic sequences, meters flickering in near-random bursts. Every machine seemed poised to record, analyze, or transmit, yet there was no human operator, only the faint residue of past activity. And beneath it all, threading through every observation, was the persistent pull of the signal, a living presence that seemed to inhabit both the room and his consciousness. It was then that he noticed something else, a series of small lenses, mounted at angles along the walls and ceiling, partially obscured by dust and decay. At first they appeared ornamental, remnants of some bygone optical experiment, but the more he looked, the more he realized their purpose. They were cameras or perhaps surveillance devices, positioned to capture every corner, every movement within the room. He felt the weight of their silent observation, the sense that the room itself had been watching, long before he arrived, and perhaps continued to do so even now. It was not malevolent exactly, but it was omniscient, a quiet intelligence embedded in machinery, waiting, documenting, absorbing. As he examined the tapes and papers more closely, he began to recognize familiar names and dates, his own work, fragments of his own recordings, and those of several others in the 22. It became clear that this was not random. He was part of a pattern, a sequence, a network of observers and observed, woven into the very fabric of the broadcast. The air in the room seemed to tighten, charged with an unspoken expectation. Every shadow, every flicker of light, every faint vibration of the floor seemed designed to impress upon him the fact that he was no longer merely a passive listener. He was participating in an experiment whose scope and intent were unknown, yet whose consequences were already unfolding. Another of the 22, unaware of his colleague's discovery, arrived hours later, guided by the same subtle pull that had led the first. Unlike the first, she entered through a side door partially hidden behind overgrown ivy, almost as if the building itself had invited her through a secret path. Her first impression was the pervasive stillness, a quiet that was almost deafening, broken only by the soft, insistent hum threading through the walls. She felt it immediately. The pull of the broadcast intensified here, as if the room had been designed to amplify its influence. Her eyes traced the lines of cables, panels, and instruments, and she noticed immediately the same cameras and lenses that had been overlooked by casual observers. She understood at once that this was a place not of mere observation, but of surveillance and study, a space that existed to see what normally could not be seen. Together, in overlapping time but unaware of the other's exact presence, the two began to piece together the history of the room. It was once a station, perhaps clandestine, dedicated to monitoring and transmitting signals that touched on knowledge considered too dangerous to share freely. Note hinted at attempts to measure human reaction, to understand how information travels, not only through machines but through minds. The realization was staggering. The broadcast that had drawn them here had not merely been a curiosity. It was a product of careful observation, meticulously constructed, perhaps even designed to target those who were curious enough to follow it. And yet, the intent, benevolent, experimental, or something darker, remained unclear, shrouded in the dust and shadows of decades-long abandonment. Every corner of the room seemed to suggest layers of hidden purpose. Drawers revealed documents encrypted with symbols that resisted understanding. Cabinets contained reels of magnetic tape, some bearing dates that predated the earliest reports. Of the broadcast, a thin layer of dust on the floor indicated occasional movement, as if someone or something had passed through, unseen and unrecorded. The air carried a tension, electric yet still, like the calm before a storm, amplifying the psychological effects that the 22 were already beginning to experience through their exposure to the broadcast. Even as they explored, the hum of the signal threaded through their consciousness, tugging at their awareness in ways subtle and insistent. The more they investigated, the more they felt themselves entwined with the room, as though its purpose was not merely to be discovered, but to reshape perception. Shadows seemed to cling to their peripheries, flickering against walls that were bare, whispering just beyond comprehension. It was as though the room had absorbed all the knowledge, all the attention of those who had come before, and now it measured, catalogued, and responded to those who dared to enter. By the time they left the room, hours later, a strange clarity and unease had settled upon them both. The building, the instruments, the lenses, and the residual hum of the broadcast had revealed a truth that could not be ignored. They were no longer mere listeners. They were participants, now entangled with a history that was invisible to the world, a narrative that had unfolded long before they arrived, and whose implications would echo through their minds in ways both subtle and profound. The room of unseen eyes had revealed itself, and in doing so had extended the reach of the broadcast further into the lives of those who had dared to listen. The discovery of the room of unseen eyes had left a lingering weight on their minds, a sense that the world they'd known existed only as a fragile layer atop something infinitely more complex and unknowable. Yet it was only when they ventured deeper into the recesses of the derelict station, guided by cables, faded markings, and the subtle hum that threaded through the walls, that the true breadth of the broadcast's reach began to reveal itself. Tucked behind rusted filing cabinets, hidden beneath loose floorboards, and sealed within weathered vaults were hundreds of documents, reels of tape, and carefully preserved recordings that had survived decades of neglect. The 22, now drawn, closer together by shared fascination and mutual curiosity, slowly began to sift through these artifacts, each item offering a glimpse into the knowledge that had been deemed too dangerous to be disseminated openly. The first items they encountered were notebooks, their pages filled with meticulous handwriting in varying scripts. Some were densely packed with cryptic symbols, mathematical sequences that resisted immediate comprehension, and diagrams that hinted at experiments and observations that stretched beyond conventional understanding. Other entries were more personal, reflections and annotations by unknown authors who had once studied the signal, recording every subtle effect, every anomaly, every emotional tremor observed in the subjects. It became apparent that the signal was not merely a broadcast. It was part of an ongoing experiment, a probe into the boundaries of perception, curiosity, and human comprehension. And as they turned each page, the weight of realization pressed upon them. This knowledge had consequences that could ripple outward long before anyone fully grasped its significance. Reels of tape were next, stored carefully in padded boxes, some labeled in faded ink, others bearing only cryptic sequences of letters and numbers. When played, the tapes produced a sound that was at once familiar and profoundly alien, fragments of the broadcast from decades past, punctuated by moments of clarity in which voices could be discerned, sometimes whispering in languages that were recognizable yet twisted, distorted, or entirely unknown. These voices seemed to contain intent, messages encoded in tone, rhythm, and inflection rather than in literal words. Listeners reported a peculiar sensation: understanding without comprehension, awareness without articulation. It was as if the knowledge embedded within the sound bypassed conventional thought entirely, lodging itself directly into perception, memory, and emotion. Among the documents were letters, some addressed to no one, others intended for individuals whose identities had long been erased from records. These letters spoke in a formal, precise tone, hinting at knowledge that could alter the course of events, influence decision-making, or manipulate perception on a subtle but profound scale. One letter suggested that certain patterns in sound could unlock dormant cognitive abilities, while another warned of the dangers of pursuing understanding too aggressively. The language was measured yet ominous, the caution unmistakable. Curiosity was not a neutral act. The letters suggested that knowledge itself was an active force, capable of influencing those who sought it, bending their perception of reality and reshaping the very way in which they thought and felt. The 22 began to realize that the archive was not a static repository, but a living record, reflecting the interplay between human curiosity and the broadcast itself. As they explored, they noticed patterns emerging across the documents and recordings, subtle correspondences that hinted at coordination, design, and purpose. Certain symbols appeared repeatedly, as though encoded into multiple items across decades. Dates aligned in strange sequences, suggesting events unfolding in parallel across time and space. Even the smallest details, the tilt of a diagram, the spacing of words, the occasional repetition of sound on a tape, seemed intentional, as though the archive itself were attempting to communicate a structure too intricate for casual understanding. With each discovery, a creeping weight settled upon their minds. It was not immediate terror or panic, but a slow, reflective anxiety that grew as understanding deepened. The knowledge they uncovered carried a sense of gravity, a subtle insistence that the world was far more complex, more layered, and more mutable than they had ever imagined. Philosophical questions began to surface unbidden. Why are some truths forbidden? Is knowledge inherently dangerous, or is danger born only from the misuse of understanding? Can human curiosity ever be contained? Or is it destined to ripple outward, touching minds and lives in ways that cannot be controlled? And most haunting of all, Is the pursuit of forbidden knowledge a moral choice or an inevitable consequence of consciousness itself? The tapes revealed more than just sound, they revealed intention. One recording, faint and crackling, appeared to be a conversation between two unseen figures discussing the broadcast's effects on early listeners. Their voices were calm, almost clinical, yet the content suggested awareness of human susceptibility to the signal's influence. They spoke of patterns, of cognitive dissonance, of subtle manipulations designed to measure, provoke, and record. There was no overt malevolence, yet the clinical precision of their observation created unease that was difficult to articulate. The 22 could not help but wonder whether they too were now subjects in a continuing experiment, participants in a chain of events that had been set in motion long before they'd heard the first hum of the broadcast. Even the seemingly mundane artifacts, office supplies, faded calendars, coffee cups coated in decades of dust, carried resonance. Each was a reminder that this archive had been a place of human attention, of effort and obsession. The 22 imagined the long hours spent here, the tireless dedication of those who had sought to observe the effects of the broadcast, the careful cataloguing of every tremor in thought or behavior. It was both intimate and impersonal, a study of minds conducted with quiet reverence, yet detached from compassion. They were witnessing a human curiosity mirrored through the lens of the broadcast, a reflection of their own impulses and vulnerabilities magnified across time. As they continued their exploration, the slow accumulation of knowledge became a psychological burden. Understanding the structure of the archive, the meticulousness of its organization, and the subtle connections between recordings, letters, and symbols introduced a creeping awareness of responsibility. They began to question whether simply possessing this information was an ethical act. Did the archive exist to inform or to warn? Was the pursuit of comprehension a noble endeavor or a perilous indulgence? And with every new discovery, the boundaries between knowledge and obsession blurred, leaving them in a liminal space where curiosity carried as much danger as promise. The archive also revealed glimpses of failure, records of those who had pursued understanding too aggressively, who had been unprepared for the psychological and emotional consequences of exposure. There were fragments of personal accounts, incomplete diaries, and recordings that trailed off into silence. These remnants offered lessons, though harsh and subtle, about the human cost of knowledge untempered by caution. The 22 could not ignore these echoes, which whispered of lives disrupted, minds unmoored, and fates forever altered. And yet, despite these warnings, the allure of the archive remained irresistible, a quiet magnet drawing them deeper into its mysteries. Every corner of the room seemed to reinforce the duality of discovery and danger. Shelves lined with organized stacks of documents suggested order, while the occasional chaos of scattered papers and broken reels hinted at the inherent instability of the knowledge contained within. The 22 began to feel the tension between these extremes, the desire to understand, the fear of consequence, and the subtle pull of the broadcast threading through both. Even in silence, they could sense the hum's influence, a reminder that knowledge was not merely inert but alive, capable of nudging, guiding, and reshaping those who sought it. In reflective moments, some of the 22 wondered whether the archive itself had consciousness, whether it had been designed not only to preserve knowledge, but to interact with those who uncovered it. The idea seemed fantastical, yet the meticulous design, the recurrence of patterns and the way the materials resonated with the broadcast suggested an intelligence beyond the human. And so while they documented, analyzed, and theorized, they also felt a growing reverence, an awareness that they were in the presence of something far larger than themselves, something that demanded both humility and careful consideration. By the end of their exploration, the 22 were irrevocably changed. They had glimpsed fragments of forbidden knowledge, encountered ideas and phenomena that challenged their understanding of reality and touched a part of the world that few had ever known existed. The archive had revealed not only information, but the intricate, unsettling ways in which curiosity itself interacts with consciousness, perception, and the unknown. It was a quiet, patient force, both revealing and withholding, offering insight and danger in equal measure. And as they prepared to leave, each felt the lingering hum of the broadcast, a reminder that the archive was not simply a place, but a continuing influence, a subtle presence that would follow them long after they had stepped back into the ordinary world. The 22 were more than mere listeners of the broadcast. They were individuals with histories, quietly etched lives, each carrying a tapestry of experience that shaped how they perceived the hum, the static, and the whispers of knowledge that now threaded through their consciousness. To understand the depth of their entanglement with the signal, one had to look beyond the fascination with sound or the curiosity that had drawn them to the unknown. Each had fears, desires, and private. Worlds that the broadcast seemed to touch, in ways both subtle and profound, reflecting back their inner lives with an uncanny precision. Among them was a woman who spent her days in libraries, surrounded by the calm weight of books and the rhythm of turning pages. Her curiosity had always been gentle, a slow exploration of patterns, languages, and stories. The hum of the broadcast reached her like a hidden thread woven through the familiar texture of her life, drawing her attention not with alarm, but with a quiet insistence. It awakened long-forgotten questions about her own perception of reality, the details of events remembered incorrectly, conversations half-recalled, the shadows that lingered in corners of memory. The signal whispered in tones she could not fully decipher, yet it mirrored her thoughtfulness, her patience, and her ability to notice what others overlooked. Another among the 22 was a man whose career had revolved around numbers, sequences, and patterns, a mathematician with an obsessive attention to detail. The broadcast spoke to him in rhythms and disruptions, a code that teased the edges of comprehension. At night he would lie awake, listening to the static, recognizing fragments of sequence embedded within the noise, attempting to unravel meaning that might forever elude him. The hum did not terrify him. Rather, it resonated with his meticulous mind, compelling him to connect dots he had never seen before, Tatra's connections not yet made. Yet beneath the calm pursuit of understanding, there was a gnawing unease. The realization that some patterns were meant to remain unseen, some sequences never fully solved, and some knowledge carried consequences far beyond his control. There was a young artist who had always observed the world through subtle shifts in light, shadow, and color. The signal appeared to her as a texture rather than sound, a vibration that threaded through her creative sensibilities, altering the way she perceived everyday life. She began to notice patterns in nature that seemed to echo the hum, fleeting alignments of shapes and colors, coincidences that carried a strange, almost deliberate weight. Her dreams became elaborate tableaux, painted with imagery that suggested narratives beyond conscious understanding. The hum wove itself into these visions, sometimes guiding her brush, sometimes leaving only fragments of suggestion, and always leaving her with a sense of awe intertwined with a growing apprehension about what she was glimpsing. Another participant, an engineer accustomed to precise systems and predictable outcomes, encountered the broadcast as a disruption to order. Where he sought control, the signal imposed ambiguity. Where he expected clarity, it offered paradox. Yet paradoxically, this disruption fascinated him, drawing him toward late-night investigations and the slow assembly of fragments into tentative conclusions. He began documenting every anomaly, every ripple in perception, as if preparing for an eventual understanding that always remained just out of reach. The hum did not merely infiltrate his nights. It began to shape his days, altering decisions, rearranging priorities, and introducing subtle compulsion to observe, record, and respond to signals he could neither fully interpret nor resist. Fears surfaced gently but persistently across the 22. Each had anxieties woven from personal history, the lingering trauma of loss, the quiet guilt of unspoken regrets, the hidden terror of failure. The broadcast did not confront these fears directly. It worked subtly, amplifying the shadows at the edges of thought, revealing vulnerabilities without harshness, encouraging reflection without judgment. In their own private spaces, each listener began to sense that the hum carried not only knowledge, but also an awareness of their interior lives. It echoed the fears they had long suppressed, magnified their questions, and in quiet, reflective moments invited them to consider the fragility and depth of their existence. Motivations, too, were revealed slowly, like faint stars in a night sky, gradually coming into view. Some sought understanding purely for curiosity's sake, a desire to perceive beyond the ordinary confines of reality. Others were driven by the compulsion to solve, to map, to structure, to impose logic on a signal that resisted containment. A few approached with caution, sensing danger yet unable to resist the lure of forbidden knowledge. Each motivation, however, personal and varied, carried the same underlying thread, an engagement with the broadcast that went beyond listening, beyond observation, and into participation. In this engagement, the hum became more than sound. It became a mirror reflecting their inner world with deliberate subtlety. Relationships and connections, often unnoticed in ordinary life, began to merge in quiet ways among the 22. Though many were strangers, separated by geography and circumstance, subtle coincidences began to intertwine their lives. A journal entry mirrored a thought another had recorded, a fragment of a tape aligned with a recollection from someone else's experience. An address or location appeared in one document, overlapping with an entirely unrelated observer's investigation. These faint intersections hinted at the threads of fate drawing them together, threads so delicate they could almost be missed, yet persistent enough to suggest design or perhaps inevitability. It was as if the hum itself had begun weaving their lives into a shared tapestry, aligning moments and choices across distance and time, preparing them slowly and quietly for convergence. Intimacy and observation became a silent theme. Each participant began to examine not only the broadcast but their own thoughts, motivations, and fears with an intensity that was private yet profound. There was a slow, reflective rhythm to their nights, listening to static, jotting notes, pausing to contemplate patterns, and surrendering to the gentle pull of wonder mixed with apprehension. This intimacy was not dramatic or overwhelming. It was quiet, like the attention paid to a single candle flame in a dark room, subtle yet consuming. And as they moved through this interior exploration, they began to sense a kinship, not yet spoken, not yet fully formed, with others who had been drawn by the same hum, guided by the same curiosity, and altered in similarly delicate ways. Hints of the interconnectedness of their fates appeared in small, almost imperceptible forms. One participant discovered a drawing that depicted a configuration remarkably similar to a dream experienced by another. A photograph tucked into a notebook seemed to capture a location that had been visited independently by someone else among the 22. Even minor coincidences, numbers, dates, phrases, began to recur, suggesting patterns that extended beyond individual experience into a network of subtle influence. Each of these hints was gentle, woven like a whisper across the expanse of their collective lives, enough to provoke thought and curiosity without forcing comprehension. The tension built slowly, a quiet anticipation that something larger was preparing to unfold, an eventual convergence whose significance they could sense but not yet name. The calm reflection of their daily lives contrasted sharply with the undercurrent of unease generated by the broadcast. Ordinary routines continued, yet were overlaid with the subtle awareness that nothing was entirely ordinary anymore. Shadows moved with meaning, sounds carried echoes of the hum, and fleeting coincidences hinted at patterns unseen. Each participant lived in a liminal space, aware that their existence was entwined with something beyond conventional perception, and yet reluctant to abandon the quiet rhythms of life they had always known. The duality of wonder and fear became a constant companion, a gentle tension that both sustained and unsettled them. As the 22 navigated the quiet intersections of their lives, they also began to recognize the philosophical implications of their experiences. What does it mean to know too much? Can human curiosity ever be entirely contained, or is the pursuit of knowledge an inevitable force that reshapes the knower as much as the known? Are connections between people, fate, coincidence, alignment, truly random? Or are they guided by forces as subtle and pervasive as the hum itself? Each question lingered unanswered, hovering like a distant echo in the mind, intensifying the sense of anticipation, of threads slowly tightening toward a future moment whose significance was yet unseen. By the time the first months of listening had passed, the 22 were transformed not by drama or spectacle, but by quiet awareness. They were more attuned to the hum, more sensitive to the nuances of sound, perception, and coincidence, and more aware of the intricate threads that connected their lives. The signal had reached beyond auditory experience into consciousness, shaping thought, memory, and intuition. Their fears, motivations, and relationships had become subtle instruments in a larger, unfolding narrative, one that moved inexorably toward convergence. And so, as they lay awake at night, listening to static that seemed to breathe with intention, a quiet understanding settled upon them. Each life, each choice, each whispered thought had been noted, aligned, and folded into a larger pattern. The 22 were bound not by geography or circumstance alone, but by the gentle pull of curiosity, the persistent rhythm of the hum, and the invisible, patient design of something that had been waiting for them all along. Names, once private and solitary, were now etched into the silent web of a story far greater than any individual, a narrative whose full revelation would come slowly, inevitably, and with consequences that could not yet be known. Even as the 22 became more intimately entwined with the hum of the broadcast, a subtle rhythm began to infiltrate their awareness, one that suggested not just presence, but purpose. It was almost imperceptible at first, like a heartbeat, beneath the ambient noise of daily life, a faint pulse that threaded itself through recordings, documents, and dreams. Some noticed patterns in timestamps on the tapes, seemingly innocuous marks that, upon closer inspection, repeated with unnerving precision. Others observed that the static contained irregular interruptions, faint surges or dips in frequency that mirrored intervals in their own perception of time. Their realization emerged slowly, like dawn brushing over a quiet landscape. There was a cadence to the signal, a hidden measure that suggested an approaching event, a climax whose magnitude none could yet gauge. The countdown was not audible in the way a clock ticks or a bell chimes. It was felt, perceived through intuition, through fleeting impressions, through the subtle tug of curiosity and unease. One listener noted the sensation most clearly in dreams, where sequences of images, sounds, and symbols repeated with the same rhythm as the hidden timestamps. A darkened corridor might stretch endlessly, punctuated by a light that flickered at precise intervals. A fragment of conversation might echo, subtly altered each time it appeared, like notes in a prelude whose resolution was not yet offered. These experiences were disquieting, not terrifying, but they instilled a sense of tension that was impossible to dismiss. Each night, the hum seemed to thrum more insistently, threading the countdown into subconscious awareness, making it inescapable. Even in ordinary moments, internal conflict intensified as they began to consider the implications. Should they try to understand the pattern, to calculate the end point, or to resist altogether? The human desire to know clashed with the fear of consequence. Some among the 22 felt compelled to track the sequences, recording times, frequencies, and anomalies, meticulously charting the subtle variations in the broadcast. Others hesitated, aware that comprehension might bind them more tightly to whatever event the countdown heralded. That observation might be participation, that curiosity itself could act as a lever pulling them forward. The tension was not external, it was internal, a quiet struggle that played out in sleepless hours and reflective pauses, an intimate tug-of-war between desire and caution. The warning signs were never blatant. They emerged in quiet gestures, a page marked with numbers that seemed to line with other obscure notes, a slight pause in the static that coincided with an inexplicable dream, a reflection in a window that seemed slightly delayed or misaligned. Observers noticed these details, and while each on its own could be rationalized, the accumulation of anomalies formed a tapestry of unease. Each small irregularity whispered a message that was both alluring and threatening. Pay attention, the world is not as it seems, and something is approaching. It was subtle yet undeniable, a tension threading through thought and perception, through waking life and dreams alike. Philosophical reflection accompanied the mounting sense of urgency. They questioned the nature of time itself, whether the countdown was literal or psychological, whether it measured external events or tracked the subtle unfolding of awareness within themselves. Was it a warning or a guide? Could a signal, a pattern or a rhythm truly dictate consequence, or was the effect born entirely from human perception? Each question deepened the internal tension, layering their thoughts with unease and fascination. Some found themselves obsessing over minor details, replaying tapes and notes repeatedly, searching for patterns that might explain the invisible clockwork. Others withdrew into quiet contemplation, attempting to hold the anxiety at bay, reminding themselves that observation could be done without surrendering to fear, that understanding could exist without consequence. But always the hum threaded, its quiet insistence into their consciousness, refusing dismissal. The countdown began to affect even ordinary routines. Meals were interrupted by the compulsion to check recordings. Brief moments of interaction with others were colored by a preoccupation with sequences and intervals. Sleep became tentative, punctuated by restless dreams in which faint glimmers of light pulsed in precise rhythm. The 22 became attuned to signals in the environment, noting the flicker of bulbs, the irregular click of distant machinery, and even the subtle cadence of footsteps outside their windows. The ordinary world seemed overlaid with a hidden layer of significance, and the weight of unspoken anticipation pressed against them like a quiet current, pulling attention and thought toward a climax they could neither fully understand nor prevent. Despite this tension, there were moments of deceptive calm. They would sit for hours in study or reflection, listening to tapes, analyzing notes, or simply staring at the flickering static. In these quiet hours, the countdown felt suspended, a latent force rather than an active one, giving the illusion that time could be stretched, paused, or ignored. Yet even in these pauses, subtle incidents reminded them that the approach of the unknown was inexorable. A misplaced object might reappear in allocation that defied explanation. A recorded voice might repeat a phrase in a dream, just as it had in the broadcast. The hum itself occasionally surged in volume, startlingly precise, a reminder that the pattern persisted even when attention faltered. The psychological strain was compounded by the subtle interpersonal tensions among the 22. Though bound by shared fascination and experience, each participant responded differently to the emerging urgency. Some approached it with methodical diligence, attempting to impose structure on the chaotic signals. Others succumbed to anxiety, withdrawing or obsessing over minor inconsistencies. A quiet conflict arose in thought. Was the countdown a test, a threat, or merely a pattern meant to be observed? Each internal debate mirrored the larger unseen tension of the broadcast, creating a network of interwoven anticipation and doubt. And yet, the group had not yet convened, their awareness largely solitary, connected only through the echo of a shared experience mediated by static and hum. In quiet reflection, some began to notice the subtle ways the countdown shaped perception beyond the immediate signal. Shadows seemed longer in certain rooms, colors slightly shifted, and sound carried an odd resonance as though the hum extended into the physical world, calibrating the senses of those attuned to it. One observer reported the sensation that clocks in her home ticked unevenly, as if the passage of time were being subtly modulated. Another noted an unusual alignment of celestial bodies, a coincidence that seemed too precise to ignore. These observations were fragmentary, disjointed, and yet they collectively reinforced the sense of a measured approach, a pattern not merely within recordings or documents, but encoded in the very fabric of perception itself. Even ordinary objects took on significance. A cup left on a desk might seem to vibrate faintly in rhythm with the hidden pattern. The rustle of paper, the hum of a refrigerator, the faint drip of a faucet, all became part of the unconscious measure, reminding participants that the countdown was both external and internal, measurable in the world and in the mind. Subtle reflection and observation became the primary means of engagement, the most powerful tool against the uncertainty, yet also the most precarious. Attention itself could amplify the signal, drawing the observer deeper into its quiet logic. The subtle pressure of the countdown finally manifested in an incident that, though small, carried a disquieting weight. One evening, as the hum pulsed faintly through a participant's apartment, a reel of tape, stored carefully on a shelf, inexplicably slipped from its resting place and spun to the floor. It did not break, nor was it tampered with by any visible hand, yet the sound it produced when played was unfamiliar, a distorted, elongated fragment of the broadcast that none of the 22 had heard before, overlaid with a whisper of a voice so faint it could almost be imagined. It paused, repeated, and then fell silent, leaving the observer in an oppressive quiet, aware that the countdown was no longer abstract. Something unseen had moved, a signal had acted independently, and the tension of the approaching climax had been rendered tangible, however subtly. In the aftermath of this incident, the 22 were left with heightened awareness and a creeping sense of inevitability. The countdown had ceased to be theoretical. It had become perceptible, an undercurrent threading through every thought, every observation, every flicker of awareness. And yet the most unnerving aspect was not its approach, but the sense that it could not be fully understood, predicted, or avoided. The hum and the static had evolved beyond mere auditory phenomena. They had become markers of consciousness itself, quiet measures of presence, expectation, and preparation. By the end of the night, the hum settled into the background once more. Leaving the apartment in stillness, yet a faint tension lingered. The observer knew that the real, the subtle voice, and the unseen rhythm of the broadcast had changed the fabric of perception irrevocably. The countdown continued, invisible to the untrained eye, inaudible to the casual ear, but present nonetheless, a quiet, inexorable measure that would follow the 22 through the nights to come, threading anticipation, curiosity, and unease into every thought, dream, and interaction, leading them step by step toward the convergence that awaited in silence. The hum of the broadcast, once a subtle pulse threading through the minds of the 22, began to manifest in ways that were no longer merely auditory or psychological. It infiltrated their senses with a more insistent, almost tangible presence. A flicker of movement at the edge of vision, a shape that seemed to shift when unobserved, a fleeting sound that echoed faintly behind ordinary conversation, all of these subtle anomalies began to accumulate, weaving a fabric of unease that felt both intimate and pervasive. The 22 started to perceive the hum as more than static. It had become a medium through which the world itself seemed to bend, a channel that refracted ordinary reality into distortions that could not be dismissed or rationalized. At first, thesophenomena were gentle, almost imperceptible, like whispers, at the periphery of thought. One participant noticed upon entering a dimly lit room that shadows stretched slightly longer than logic allowed, pooling and thinning in ways that defied expectation. Another reported that objects seemed subtly rearranged between glances, their positions shifting in patterns that suggested intent rather than accident. These shifts were not overtly alarming. They were curious, delicate, and hypnotic, demanding attention through repetition and subtlety. Each irregularity drew awareness, and in drawing awareness, the broadcast gained influence, gently bending perception, threading expectation and imagination into a quiet symphony of unease. Hallucinations, initially fleeting and dreamlike, began to infiltrate waking life. A man might glimpse a figure standing across the street, only to see it dissolve when approached. A woman would hear whispers threaded into ambient sound, voices that mimicked familiar tones, yet articulated unfamiliar words, fleeting but insistently present. The 22 did not scream or panic. The experiences were subtle, almost seductive, as though the hum itself invited contemplation. Each hallucination was accompanied by the faint sense of logic or purpose, a thread that suggested the occurrence was not random, but deliberate, calculated to draw attention and perhaps compliance. The more they observed, the more the boundaries between reality and the hum's influence blurred. Compulsions emerged quietly, imperceptibly, like small threads woven into routine thought. One participant found an irresistible urge to replay a particular taper-tot hours, the hum within it compelling attention to previously unnoticed patterns. Another became obsessed with documenting every anomaly, every flicker of movement or sound, even when doing so interrupted work or sleep. These compulsions were not overtly violent or chaotic. They were subtle, precise, and hypnotic, guided by the persistent rhythm of the broadcast. Each acted without questioning the impulse, unaware that the hum had begun shaping behavior as thoroughly as it had altered perception. Strange coincidences accumulated, each a delicate echo of influence, subtle, enough to be rationalized individually, but unnerving in combination. A street lamp might flicker precisely as a thought of danger arose. A phrase in a conversation might repeat the wording of a recent recording, though no connection seemed possible. Dreams began to synchronize among participants in faint, fragmentary ways, as if the hum threaded itself not only through perception but across minds. These coincidences reinforced the notion of surveillance, the creeping awareness that attention was not entirely their own, that the hum had a measure of agency or awareness extending beyond passive observation. The 22 began to feel watched, not by human eyes, not by a recognizable entity, but by the presence of the broadcast itself. Shadows appeared at the corners of rooms, always just beyond focus, movements suggested but never fully captured. Reflections in glass carried subtle distortions, faces elongated, proportions shifted, angles misaligned in ways too precise to be accidental. This perception of being observed was both unsettling and hypnotic, creating a rhythm of tension and fascination that pervaded even ordinary tasks. They did not rush to leave or confront these experiences. The pull of the hum was steady, like a current beneath the skin, compelling attention and reflection, feeding curiosity even as it seeded unease. In reflective moments, participants began to question the nature of these experiences. Were the hallucinations real? Were the compulsions inherent to their psychology or imposed from without? Was the hum alive, aware, manipulative, or merely an echo of a deeper pattern in perception itself? The questions were endless, recursive, and in some ways unanswerable. Each attempt to understand the phenomena only deepened their engagement, pulling attention more fully into the orbit of the broadcast. Even when doubt arose, the subtle insistence of coincidence, the hypnotic pull of sound and shadow, and the intangible sense of being watched maintained influence, a quiet authority that could not be ignored. The room in which they listened became a theater of experience. Dim lights and the low hum produced a perceptual landscape in which boundaries blurred. A participant might stare at a static-filled screen and perceive fleeting shapes, figures, or patterns emerging from the noise, vanishing when focus sharpened. Another noticed the sound of distant doors closing in the hum, perfectly timed to their own internal rhythms, suggesting alignment between mind and broadcast. These experiences were disorienting yet strangely intimate, a dialogue with the unseen, a participation that felt both personal and collective. The hum had begun to orchestrate events as much as it had observed them, threading influence through thought, perception, and ambient reality. Sleep became a liminal space of heightened experience. Dreams overlapped with fragments of recordings and ambient sounds, merging memory with hallucination in vivid hypnotic tableau. One participant dreamed of a figure moving through a labyrinth of light and shadow, the walls inscribed with symbols from notes discovered in the archive. Another envisioned the hum itself as a tactile presence, coiling and uncoiling through the body, marking time and influencing thought. Even in waking hours, the residue of these dreams lingered, bending decision, mood, and perception, reinforcing the sense of participation in a force that was patient, persistent, and subtly manipulative. Despite these growing effects, the participants were not panicked. Their responses were measured, reflective, and hypnotically slow. The narrative of the hum unfolded not through sudden shocks, but through repetition, rhythm, and gentle insistence. Each anomaly, hallucination, or coincidence was a small puzzle piece, a fragment of a larger pattern whose significance was only partially understood. The 22 navigated these experiences with a calm attentiveness that paradoxically heightened their susceptibility. Observation itself became a vector for influence, and curiosity, the very trait that had drawn them, became both compass and tether. The cumulative effect was subtle but profound. By day, small compulsions guided behavior, influencing movement, choice, and attention. By night, shadows in the frequency whispered in dreams, hallucinations, and ambient sound, creating a continuity of influence that left the 22 altered in ways difficult to articulate. They began to sense that their minds and the hum were entwined, that the broadcast had become a participant in consciousness, a collaborator in perception, and a quiet manipulator of awareness. Every glance, step, and reflection was tinged with the sense that the hum knew, observed, and responded. As the tension mounted, a small but unnerving incident brought the influence into sharper relief. One participant, while reviewing recordings, late at night, noted a sudden interruption. The static coalesced into a whisper, faintly echoing a question previously posed aloud in conversation, but in a voice that was neither familiar nor fully comprehensible. The sound persisted for only a few seconds before dissolving back into static, yet the implication was unmistakable. The broadcast had not merely observed, it had reacted. The observer felt a shiver of recognition, a quiet understanding that the hum's presence was no longer passive and that subtle manipulation had become possible, perhaps inevitable. By the end of this night, the 22 carried a quiet tunis, an awareness of the breadth of influence the broadcast exerted over perception, thought, and behavior. Shadows in the frequency had revealed themselves not as phantoms, but as instruments, subtle orchestrations of attention, awareness, and compulsion. Each hallucination, coincidence, and impulse had been carefully measured, threading their lives into a rhythm not of their own making. And as they drifted to sleep, the hum persisted, steady and hypnotic, leaving a final unsettling impression. Awareness was no longer entirely their own, and the broadcast's influence was only beginning to unfold. In the quiet interludes between listening sessions, the 22 began to communicate not directly, but through objects left in liminal spaces, folded sheets of paper, small recordings, fragments of journals, or even notes stuck into old books. These letters were never conventional, never fully linear in thought or form. They were poetic and fragmented, reflections of perception warped subtly by the hum of the broadcast. Each participant began to articulate experiences that could not be spoken aloud, emotions that were too fragile for direct confession, insights that existed at the boundary between understanding and confusion. The act of leaving a message became both ritual and necessity, a tether to others and a record of personal navigation through a world altered by sound and shadow. The tone of the letters was often melancholic, laced with quiet wonder, curiosity, and unease. One message described a recurring image in a dream, a spiral of light folding in on itself, drawing attention towards something unseen. Words were carefully chosen to convey sensation rather than fact. A description of color might evoke sound. A thought might imply spatial distortion. These letters, though private, were intended for others who shared the hum's influence, and yet each message was also a mirror. The writer could see in its phrasing their own fear, fascination, and altered cognition. It was as if the letters themselves became another medium for the broadcast, a conduit for reflection, compulsion, and subtle influence. Journals accumulated in hidden places, each page dense with fragmented observation. One participant wrote of hallucinations that lingered longer than the moments that produced them, describing figures that moved like shadows at the edge of perception, gestures that were almost human yet entirely alien. Another recorded compulsions and coincidental patterns, noting the pull of the hum on thought, attention, and emotion, and observing how the signal seemed to anticipate response before the conscious mind could fully register it. These fragments were not explanatory. They were evocative, a poetic attempt to articulate the unarticulatable, to mark experience that exceeded language, yet demanded record. Recordings, too, were left in precise locations, under desks, inside locked drawers, or in boxes marked with faint symbols from the archive. Voices on these tapes were quiet, reflective, almost confessional. Participants described fleeting visions, subtle compulsions, and internal conflicts with an intimacy that was impossible to convey to those outside the 22. The hum, ever present, colored these recordings, giving cadence to speech, subtle rhythm to pauses, and a persistent backdrop of static that seemed to underscore meaning even when words failed. These recordings became both artifacts and instruments, capturing more than words, recording not only the message but the emotional resonance of the sender under the influence of the broadcast. A sense of temporality was embedded in the act of leaving messages. Letters might be left days or weeks apart, yet some participants felt as though the messages responded to one another in real time, as if an unseen connection threaded them together. Beyond conventional understanding of time and distance, observations in one note might echo, almost verbatim, fragments of an earlier dream or hallucination experienced by another. The 22 began to sense patterns that were larger than themselves, emergent and recursive, creating a network of communication that was simultaneously collaborative and intimate, yet impossible to fully map or comprehend. This network of communication carried profound psychological effects. Participants discovered that their own perceptions were shaped not only by direct interaction with the hum, but also by reading or hearing messages left by others. A carefully worded note might nudge thought in subtle ways, highlighting a previously unnoticed pattern, encouraging reflection on a particular anomaly, or evoking sensation that had not yet occurred. Messages were both reflective and generative. They preserved insight, while simultaneously extending influence, creating a lattice of perception that blurred the boundaries between individual cognition and collective awareness. Melancholy suffused these communications. Writers often remarked on the sense of isolation despite shared experience, the impossibility of fully conveying what had been observed, and the quiet toll of participation. They reflected on fleeting glimpses of the extraordinary and the permanent weight of altered perception, noting how ordinary life had been subtly transformed. Dreams were described with wonder and dread, hallucinations with curiosity and fear, and compulsions with fascination tempered by unease. Each letter or recording carried this duality, a haunting combination of awe at discovery and awareness of cost, revealing both the beauty and the subtle horror of knowledge that exceeded ordinary boundaries. Some messages vanished before they could be received. Notes left on a desk or inside a drawer were discovered to have disappeared, erased or removed without trace. Recordings were lost to technical failure, yet even this loss seemed orchestrated, as though the hum itself determined which insights would persist and which would vanish. Unread messages accumulated in boxes, envelopes, or notebooks, sometimes for days, sometimes indefinitely. Participants would return, hoping to find their words acknowledged, only to encounter emptiness, a quiet void that mirrored the unpredictability of the broadcast itself. This absence deepened the sense of fragility, of uncertainty, emphasizing the impermanence of human communication in the face of a force that existed beyond control or comprehension. Within this ephemeral networks, the 22 observed subtle influence over their cognition. A note that described a pattern in a hallucination might later appear in another participant's dream. A warning left in writing might be replayed in the subconscious during a restless night. The hum threaded itself into these interactions, guiding attention, shaping memory, and creating resonance across minds. It was never coercive in a dramatic sense, but insistently pervasive. Awareness and curiosity were gently nudged toward recognition, reflection, and engagement. Participants became aware that the broadcast's influence extended not only through direct auditory exposure, but also through the delicate ecosystem of shared communication they had created. Time itself felt altered within the exchange of messages. Days might blur, nights fold into one another, and the distinction between wakefulness and dream became subtle, almost imperceptible. Messages captured fragments of moments, leaving them suspended, alive within the minds of recipients, affecting perception across temporal distance. One participant might awaken to a note written weeks prior, only to find its content reflecting events or thoughts that had not yet occurred, creating the impression that the broadcast and the communication it inspired were guiding awareness along preordained patterns. The interplay of message, memory, and perception reinforced the quiet but inexorable influence of the hum. Even the mundane aspects of letter writing or recording were infused with poetic awareness. A single word, carefully chosen and repeated, could evoke sensations or associations far beyond its immediate meaning. Symbols, punctuation, and spacing carried rhythm, creating subtle resonance that amplified the message's effect. Fragments of dialogue, half-formed reflections, or evocative imagery were more potent than full explanations, allowing the broadcast to inhabit the space between comprehension and imagination. In this way, letters and recordings became more than tools of communication. They became instruments of perception, shaping thought and feeling as delicately as the hum-shaped auditory experience. The melancholic quality of the messages deepened as participants reflected on the consequences of understanding too much. They wrote of the subtle fracture of daily routine, the quiet estrangement from ordinary experience, and the inexorable pull of curiosity that had drawn them into this shared network. The letters were confessions, warnings, reflections, and poetry, all folded together in fragile form, a testament to human desire to share insight even when comprehension could not be fully achieved. The hum, persistent in the background, provided rhythm and continuity, binding individual experiences into a delicate, haunting lattice of collective awareness. Some messages were ignored or unread, left to linger in notebooks or recording devices for weeks or months. Others vanished, as though erased by some unseen hand or the broadcast itself. The 22 were left with the understanding that communication was fragile, impermanent, and subject to the will of forces beyond human control. This impermanence mirrored the ephemeral nature of perception itself. Glimpses of pattern, sudden awareness, fleeting insight, and fragile clarity could be lost as quickly as they were attained. Yet in the gaps, in the silences, the hum's persistent presence reminded them that experience, awareness, and influence continued, quietly and inexorably, beyond immediate comprehension. By the end of this period, the 22 were both enriched and unsettled by their network of letters, recordings, and journals. Perception had been altered, attention finely tuned, and subtle awareness heightened. Yet the loss of messages, the disappearance of fragments, and the persistent mystery of the hum left them with a sense of melancholy that was at once reflective and anticipatory. Each participant carried insights that were partially shared, partially personal and partially obscured, bound together in a lattice of understanding that was delicate, incomplete, and profoundly mysterious. In these quiet interludes, the hum threaded through every word, every pause, and every reflection, reminding the 22 that the broadcast was not a distant artifact, but an active presence in their cognition. The letters were a bridge, fragile and incomplete, yet a testament to connection, reflection, and the slow, haunting evolution of perception under the broadcast's influence. Some messages would endure, others vanish, and still others would remain unread, waiting for attention that might never come, but all carried the indelible mark of the hum and of the subtle convergence that had begun to shape their lives in ways they could not yet fully articulate. The world outside the quiet, private obsession of the 22 began to stir, though in ways so subtle that few could immediately perceive the tremors beneath everyday life. There were rumors, soft, whispered, and almost imperceptible, of disappearances that were never fully reported, events that defied easy explanation, and anomalies in data, traffic, and communication that suggested patterns beyond chance. News items arrived like half-formed fragments, stories of individuals vanishing, inexplicable occurrences in isolated towns, and strange coincidences that seemed unconnected, yet bore the same faint signature of something unseen. Those who paid attention noticed the edges first, a sudden gap in routine, a missed appointment that could not be accounted for, a delayed or altered signal in the networks that governed communication. The 22 were still largely unaware of the breadth of the world's growing awareness, yet they felt the faint brush of consequence as their actions, observations, and recordings rippled outward. The hum's influence had extended beyond perception, subtly affecting decision-making, leaving traces that intersected with the lives of others. Reports of brief lapses in ordinary events, lights flickering for no reason, doors left unlocked, objects misplaced, were dismissed as coincidence by the majority, but they formed the beginnings of a web of anomalies that quietly attracted attention. It was as if the hum had not only shaped their awareness, but prepared the world itself to notice, to act, to respond in ways measured, deliberate and slow. Investigators, though not yet aware of the 22 as a connected network, began encountering phenomena that defied conventional explanation. One officer noted a series of disappearances, each case small and seemingly unrelated, yet linked by subtle temporal or spatial coincidences. A researcher in a remote observatory discovered data anomalies in otherwise mundane signals, patterns that echoed sequences observed by the 22 in their private recordings. None could yet interpret the full significance, and the anomalies were easily dismissed individually, but their accumulation created a tension beneath the ordinary hum of daily life, a quiet expectation that something unusual was approaching, a storm, gathering in the undercurrent of the world. For the 22, this external awareness remained largely invisible, but its effects began to brush against the edges of their perception. A participant who had returned from a long day's work noted an inexplicable misalignment in the city's streetlights, echoing the subtle patterns of the hum. Another observed that someone had returned a notebook or recording without explanation, items that seemed to have shifted in transit, as if guided by forces outside human comprehension. The world, previously a steady and predictable backdrop, now vibrated with subtle responsiveness. Each coincidence, anomaly, or intervention built tension incrementally, layering unease atop the calm reflection that had defined earlier engagement with the broadcast. There was a curious contrast between the rising tension in the external world and the slow, almost hypnotic calm of the 22 as they interacted with one another through messages, recordings, and reflections. The hum's influence remained, intimate, reflecting perception, curiosity, and fear, yet now it interfaced with a larger environment whose mechanisms were oblivious to human logic. While the outside world began to react in quiet, unnoticed ways, the participants experienced this indirectly, often through fragmented observation. A light flicker here, a note returned there, a sequence of coincidences that seemed orchestrated yet inexplicable. This layering of private awareness with external response created a sense of mounting suspense, slow and inevitable, like distant thunder before the first drop of rain. The external phenomena were never dramatic. They were persistent, subtle, and disconcerting. Vehicles appeared in unexpected places, schedules shifted inexplicably, and messages sent electronically occasionally contained anomalies in content or timing. The 22, attuned to irregularities and patterns by the hum, were sensitive to these occurrences, though they could rarely trace their origin or purpose. Each anomaly built anticipation quietly, a quiet nudge toward awareness that a climax, unseen yet approaching, would soon demand full engagement. There was no panic, only the slow accumulation of unease, as the world itself seemed to become a stage upon which unseen forces were aligning events in preparation for revelation. Some of the 22 began to notice the first hints of surveillance in external interactions. Faces in crowds seemed to linger just a fraction too long. Conversations were occasionally interrupted by the inexplicable sense of presence elsewhere. Electronic devices seemed to register patterns or sequences independent of normal operation. These instances were few, subtle, and easily rationalized, yet they contributed to the growing tension, the awareness that the world was responding to forces beyond ordinary comprehension. The hum had not merely shaped cognition, it had become an unseen participant in reality itself, weaving threads between perception, coincidence, and the subtle orchestration of events. In quiet reflection, participants began to consider the philosophical implications of this external responsiveness. Was the world itself becoming aware, or were these merely intersections of probability observed with heightened sensitivity? Could their own actions, guided by the hum, have contributed to the subtle disturbances now emerging externally? Each question deepened the sense of suspense, layering anxiety with curiosity and reinforcing the hypnotic pull of observation and reflection. Even small, seemingly trivial events, a letter misplaced, a tape interrupted, a shadow noticed in peripheral vision, were imbued with significance, a foreshadowing of larger, unseen forces aligning outside conscious view. The contrast between calm observation and external anomalies intensified the narrative tension. The 22 maintained reflective, deliberate engagement with the hum, yet subtle awareness of external forces created a dual consciousness, a tension, both inward, to perception, thought, and hallucination, and outward to disturbances that hinted at an invisible hand guiding, monitoring, or responding. This dual awareness magnified suspense without overt action, creating a slow cinematic rhythm in which anticipation and anxiety intertwined with curiosity, reflection, and the quiet beauty of the hum's influence on cognition. The storm gathered. Incrementally, newspapers carried brief accounts of minor disappearances, scarcely noticed except by those who searched deliberately. Reports from communication networks hinted at signals behaving unpredictably, sequences appearing and reappearing, in patterns that resisted conventional analysis. Researchers, bureaucrats, and casual observers alike encountered anomalies that, individually, were dismissed or overlooked. Yet collectively, these signs suggested an orchestration subtle enough to avoid alarm, but persistent enough to mark a trajectory toward confrontation, awareness, or revelation. By the end of this period, the tension had reached a threshold of quiet intensity. The 22 were aware, subconsciously or explicitly, that something beyond their control had begun to respond to the hum and to their actions. The external world, previously steady, now bore faint imprints of their engagement. Events aligned, anomalies recurred, and coincidences multiplied. The storm had not broken, yet its presence was undeniable, a slow accumulation of pressure, an atmospheric prelude to revelation. The hum, persistent and patient, threaded through internal perception and external reality alike, preparing both the participants and the world for the convergence that would follow. The final moments of the section emphasized the eerie calm that contrasted with the unseen accumulation of tension. One participant noticed a brief shadow at the periphery of sight, perfectly timed with a thought of danger. A sequence of numbers on a recording appeared in a context entirely unanticipated, yet eerily aligned with recent events. A minor disruption in routine, a light flicker, a sudden pause in conversation, an inexplicable change in environment hinted that forces beyond ordinary comprehension were active, patient, and observant. The 22 experienced these incidents not with panic, but with reflective awareness, a quiet acknowledgement that the world itself had begun to respond to the hum, and that a crescendo of consequence, subtle yet inevitable, was drawing near. By nightfall, the storm remained unseen, unheard in conventional terms, yet present in perception, coincidence, and subtle anomaly. The 22 drifted through the evening with reflective attention, noting minor disruptions, examining patterns, and experiencing the faint thrill of anticipatory awareness. The hum continued its hypnotic, persistent presence, threading together cognition, perception, and subtle orchestration. The calm of observation contrasted sharply with the rising tension, creating a slow, immersive rhythm in which suspense accumulated, preparing both the participants and the world for the approaching climax that had been quietly threading its way through every thought, every observation, and every fragment of reality itself. As the influence of the broadcast deepened, the 22 found themselves drifting further from the ordinary flow of life. The world they had known, once steady and reliable, began to fragment, its edges blurred by the persistent hum threading through perception and memory. Days folded into nights with a strange hypnotic continuity. Clocks ticked in irregular rhythms that seemed perceptibly altered, as though time itself had been subtly reshaped. The participants noticed these fractures first in small, disquieting ways. A forgotten appointment, a misplaced object, a conversation recalled only in part, its details elusive, slipping like water through fingers. Each lapse in memory carried a quiet weight, a reminder that perception was no longer fully their own, and that the hum had inscribed itself not only into awareness, but into the very structure of thought. Isolation became a companion to every reflection. Even when together, the 22 felt the presence of invisible boundaries separating them from ordinary human connection. Conversations echoed partially in memory, misaligned by perception, sometimes repeated, but never perfectly coherent. Letters and recordings, once threads of intimacy and communication, began to seem distant, like messages from another time, containing fragments of understanding that could never be fully pieced together. The hum, which had guided curiosity and reflection, now imposed a gentle, persistent solitude, each participant trapped in the liminal space between insight and incomprehension, between observation and participation, between presence and dissociation. Memory itself began to distort under the weight of observation and compulsion. Recollections that had once been straightforward now flickered in fragments, incomplete and elusive. A participant might remember a hallway as longer than it had been, a window as reflecting something unseen, a voice as echoing differently than it had been spoken. These distortions were subtle, poetic, and disorienting, like viewing the world through a lens that refracted not light, but consciousness. The hum threaded through these cognitive distortions, reinforcing the sense that what was seen, remembered, or heard was not fully reliable, and that the mind had become a medium in which ordinary causality no longer applied. Hallucinations continued, their intensity heightened by the accumulation of isolation and distorted memory. A shadow at the edge of vision could linger long enough to provoke reflection on presence, agency, and intention. Sounds emerged from silence, faint whispers repeating phrases from letters, dreams, or recordings, their origin impossible to locate. The 22 began to anticipate hallucinations even before they occurred, a subtle sense that thought itself was being monitored, mirrored, or coaxed by unseen forces. These experiences were hypnotic rather than violent, poetic rather than terrifying, yet they carried the inexorable weight of inevitability. Those who had learned too much could not return to ordinary perception, could not unsee what had been revealed, and could not undo the entanglement of mind with the broadcast. Reflection became fragmented, thoughts spiraling in patterns that resembled the hum itself. A participant might contemplate a dream in which another participant appeared, only to find upon waking that memory of the encounter was inconsistent, altered by the echo of perception. Sequences of observation folded upon themselves, hallucination, influencing memory, memory influencing reflection, reflection influencing perception. The boundaries between what was real, imagined, or recorded blurred to the point that distinction became nearly impossible. Every act of reflection, every attempt to analyze, became part of the system of influence, drawing attention deeper into the rhythms, patterns, and compulsions of the broadcast. Participants noticed subtle changes in the environment that reinforced the sense of cognitive dislocation. Walls seemed to breathe imperceptibly, light filtered unevenly through windows, and familiar rooms acquired angles or shadows that were never observed before. Ordinary objects assumed significance without reason. A cup left on a table might reflect a fragment of sound from a recording, a notebook might seem to whisper when opened, a shadow might move independently of known sources. These distortions were poetic, immersive, and deeply disorienting, creating the perception that reality itself had become an extension of the hume's influence, a canvas upon which cognition, memory, and observation were subtly orchestrated. Isolation was amplified by the emotional dissonance that emerged from reflection. Participants felt the pull of curiosity and understanding, yet recognized that these gains were accompanied by irrevocable costs. Personal relationships began to strain under the weight of fragmented perception, conversations misremembered, words distorted, and intentions misinterpreted. Even brief encounters with outsiders carried subtle traces of dissonance, as though the mind, altered by the hum and the broadcast, could no longer fully inhabit the ordinary world. Melancholy and quiet resignation became recurrent companions, haunting reflection and permeating thought with the awareness that normalcy was unattainable. Compulsions persisted, growing more intricate and intertwined with hallucinations and distorted memory. A participant might be compelled to replay a tape or read a letter, knowing in some part of awareness that nothing new would be revealed, yet driven by the invisible measure of the hum. Another might meticulously chart shadows, sound fluctuations, or anomalous coincidences, constructing intricate maps that reflected both perception and hallucination. Each act of engagement deepened cognitive entanglement, reinforcing the sense that reality, memory, and thought had become inseparable from the persistent rhythm of the broadcast. These compulsions were hypnotic rather than frantic, deliberate rather than chaotic, yet they imposed a quiet, inexorable structure upon awareness, shaping cognition in ways that could not be reversed. Sleep, too, became a liminal domain, where perception and memory intertwined. Dreams repeated fragments of letters, recordings, hallucinations, and observations, creating sequences that were at once familiar and foreign. Participants often awoke, unsure which experiences had occurred in waking life and which were dream constructs, a confusion intensified by the persistent hum-threading through ambient perception. Even waking moments carried traces of these nocturnal sequences, creating continuity between dream and reality that blurred the boundaries of ordinary experience. Sleep no longer offered rest. It became another medium of influence, a subtle extension of observation, reflection, and cognitive restructuring. The cumulative effect of these experiences produced a profound awareness. Those who'd learned too much could never return to ordinary life. The hum had reshaped perception, memory, and cognition, leaving the 22 irrevocably altered. They were aware of ordinary human experience yet existed parallel to it, inhabiting a state of reflection, observation, and entanglement that rendered conventional engagement impossible. Social interaction, work, routine, all were tinged with the subtle dissonance of altered awareness and the recognition that any attempt to revert to normalcy was fundamentally futile. This awareness was neither despairing nor panicked. It was a quiet, reflective melancholy, a recognition of consequence, inevitability, and the permanence of insight. Despite the intensity of isolation and cognitive distortion, there was a poetic quality to the unraveling. Awareness, memory, and perception folded upon themselves in ways that revealed beauty alongside disorientation. Hallucinations were lyrical, compulsions rhythmic, and shadows expressive of subtle narrative patterns. Participants observed themselves as participants in a living, breathing structure of influence, simultaneously aware of the hum's orchestration and immersed in its hypnotic cadence. There was both terror and fascination, melancholy and wonder, as they realized that the broadcast had not merely altered thought, but had reshaped the very medium of experience. Fragmented memories began to accumulate into a pattern, faintly perceivable, yet never fully interpretable. One participant recalled a conversation with another in partial fragments, realizing only later that the sequence had been reconstructed from memory, hallucination, and dream, overlaid with impressions from letters and recordings. Another noted that a hallucination experienced during a sleepless night reflected a detail from a letter written days before, creating an intricate, recursive lattice of perception, memory, and reflection. These echoes of forgotten minds were simultaneously intimate and alien, poetic and unnerving, reinforcing the sense that those who had learned too much were permanently entwined with forces beyond comprehension. As this psychological unraveling progressed, participants began to sense the approach of a penultimate moment within the broadcast. Awareness sharpened, perception heightened, and attention focused in anticipation, yet the rhythm remained hypnotic, slow, and reflective. The hum threaded through thought, perception, and environment, shaping cognition, guiding reflection, and preparing the 22 for convergence without abrupt intervention. The world, altered internally and observed externally, became a quiet stage for revelation, anticipation, and confrontation, each participant aware that the next stage would be unavoidable. By the close of this section, the 22 were irrevocably transformed. Isolation, fragmented memory, distorted reality, and hypnotic compulsions had reshaped cognition, perception, and interaction with the world. The broadcast had quietly guided them toward a penultimate moment, threading awareness, reflection, and insight into a tapestry that could not be undone. Those who had learned too much could not return to ordinary life. Reality itself had become a medium of observation, influence, and poetic distortion. Shadows, whispers, compulsions, and hallucinations had all converged to leave the participants suspended in a liminal space, poised on the edge of revelation where the climax of the broadcast would soon unfold. The 22 began to notice connections that were not immediately apparent, hidden threads linking moments, messages, and experiences in a web far more intricate than they had imagined. These threads revealed themselves gradually, subtly, like water tracing invisible channels beneath the surface of familiar terrain. A line of numbers scrawled in a notebook mirrored a sequence observed in a recording. A shadow at the edge of a room echoed a shape glimpsed in a distant dream. Each discovery felt accidental, yet carried a hypnotic weight, suggesting design, pattern, and intention. The participants began to see themselves not as isolated observers, but as nodes in a quiet, unfolding network. Each interaction, observation, and reflection a point in a lattice connecting all 22. Maps began to emerge from the fragments of memory, letters, and recordings. At first, they were impressionistic, lines, symbols, and repeated motifs noticed across separate experiences. One participant traced patterns in the arrangement of shadows observed over weeks, while another charted sequences found within letters and hallucinations. Slowly, these fragments coalesced, revealing invisible paths, hidden connections threading through thought, perception, and external events. There was no map in the ordinary sense. These paths existed in cognition and memory, in observation and intuition, and in the quiet influence of the hum threading through every participant's awareness. The discovery of these connections was accompanied by a sense of quiet revelation. Observations that had once seemed coincidental now resonated with meaning. Fragmented hallucinations aligned with details from messages and patterns in recordings echoed subtle phenomena in daily life. The 22 felt a growing intimacy with the hum, as though it was guiding attention, highlighting paths and offering glimpses of structure previously invisible. Every minor insight carried weight, each realization a brushstroke in a larger, unseen mural of influence and perception. The participants experienced this awareness not with urgency, but with hypnotic, reflective attentiveness, savoring the slow unfolding of understanding. Symbols became a language of their own, subtle yet insistently present. A series of marks in a notebook, a repeated flicker of light, or a particular arrangement of shadows hinted at broader significance. The participants began to recognize motifs, spirals, echoes, sequences that seemed to recur across time and space, aligning with personal hallucinations and shared letters. The patterns were neither fully comprehensible nor fully random. They existed in the delicate liminal space between insight and incompleteness, hinting at a hidden logic, a silent orchestration, and a quiet convergence towards something greater. The hum threaded through these observations, both medium and messenger, offering gentle guidance while maintaining the mystery that defined its influence. As these invisible paths became more evident, participants noted subtle synchronicities among themselves. One person's dream might prefigure another's observation. A hallucination experienced in isolation might echo in a letter discovered days later. These coincidences, imperceptible to outsiders, reinforced the sense that the 22 were interconnected, not merely by circumstance, but by the intricate weaving of the broadcast's influence. Each participant became increasingly aware of patterns in behavior, thought, and perception, sensing that every choice, observation, and reflection contributed to a slow orchestration beyond ordinary comprehension. There was a poetic quality to the revelation of these connections. The participants observed motifs as if in a painting, sequences of numbers, shadowed shapes, or recurring images that threaded through time and space, resonating subtly with cognition and perception. Attention itself became a medium for discovery. The act of noticing a pattern, marking a line, or recording a fleeting impression drew awareness deeper into the lattice of influence. Each subtle insight reinforced both fascination and unease, the beauty of recognition tempered by the quiet realization that the paths, though observable, were beyond complete mastery. Memory played a crucial role in mapping invisible paths. Fragments of events, hallucinations, and letters resurfaced in unexpected sequences, creating patterns that seem deliberate in hindsight. One participant might recall a dream from weeks prior, now aligning with a visual pattern observed in another participant's note. Another would notice repeated sequences of sound in recordings that mirrored symbols encountered in daily hallucinations. Memory and observation merged, folding upon themselves to create a map that existed simultaneously in mind and in subtle external reality. The 22 experienced these reconstructions with slow, deliberate attention, allowing understanding to unfold naturally rather than forcibly. Even ordinary environments became part of the map. Shadows, light, sound, and spatial arrangements took on new significance as participants recognized recurring motifs. A hallway's geometry echoed shapes observed in dreams. A flickering streetlight mirrored a sequence in a recording. An overlooked mark on a wall corresponded to a symbol found in a notebook. Reality itself appeared to participate in the orchestration, presenting subtle, quiet alignments that reinforced the sense of invisible structure. The participants, attuned to these nuances, moved through spaces with heightened awareness, noting coincidences, marking observations, and tracing paths that were perceptible only through careful attention and reflection. The act of mapping became a collaborative ritual, though rarely coordinated directly. Letters, recordings, and journals served as nodes in a network, fragments of insight leaving traces that others could detect, reflect upon, and integrate into their own understanding. Subtle discoveries became shared knowledge without direct communication. A sequence noticed by one would echo in another's observation. A symbol recorded in private might influence attention elsewhere. A dream recounted indirectly would reveal alignment with prior hallucinations. The invisible paths threaded through cognition collectively, creating a lattice of perception, reflection, and influence that bound the 22 together in quiet, interwoven anticipation. As the network of connections became increasingly evident, a sense of convergence began to permeate awareness. Every subtle discovery, repeated motif, and observed alignment carried implications beyond immediate understanding. The participants recognized that their experiences were not isolated, but part of a larger structure, a slowly revealing orchestration that guided attention, reflection, and perception toward a specific, unseen endpoint. This awareness was not alarming in a dramatic sense. It was immersive, hypnotic, and poetic, a quiet acknowledgement that all paths, visible and invisible, were converging toward a point that had yet to reveal itself fully. The hum persisted as both medium and guide, threading through the emerging map of invisible paths. It connected hallucinations, compulsions, dreams, letters, and recordings, offering subtle resonance that amplified patterns while preserving ambiguity. Participants observed its influence without panic or resistance, recognizing that curiosity, attention, and reflection were being shaped in harmony with the broader lattice of awareness. Each discovery felt like a revelation, yet one tempered by the quiet understanding that the final convergence was inevitable, patient, and far larger than any single observation or insight. By the end of this stage, the 22 were fully immersed in a web of invisible paths, each node, symbol, and alignment resonating with shared cognition, perception, and reflection. The slow cinematic rhythm of discovery carried them forward gently, creating anticipation without urgency. Each participant was aware that the final broadcast, the culmination of patterns, alignments, and influence, was approaching, and that all prior experiences, insights, and observations had been preparatory, threading attention, reflection, and perception toward a moment of convergence. The section closed with a gentle but haunting sense of inevitability. Invisible paths stretched across cognition and reality, binding the 22 together in subtle, intricate alignment. Each discovery, motif, and alignment was a quiet brushstroke in the emerging tapestry, a poetic manifestation of influence, reflection, and awareness. The hum, persistent and hypnotic, continued its orchestration, weaving attention, memory, and perception into a lattice of anticipation. The participants, aware yet contemplative, understood that everything, the shadows, hallucinations, letters, compulsions, and connections, was converging slowly, inexorably toward the final broadcast, where all threads would meet in a revelation that would reshape understanding, perception, and reality itself. The hum had grown almost imperceptibly louder in the awareness of the 22, not as sound but as presence. It pulsed in the periphery of thought, threaded through reflection, and settled in the quiet spaces between perception and memory. The letters, recordings, and fragmented dreams had always hinted at patterns, alignments, and consequences, but now a subtle, almost gravitational weight settled over consciousness. The knowledge they had absorbed was no longer purely ephemeral or psychological. It had tangible ramifications. Small coincidences were revealed to carry causal weight. Minor observations produced cascading effects in ways that could not be accounted for by ordinary logic. The participants became acutely aware that their curiosity had threaded them into a web far larger than they had imagined, one that responded to attention, insight, and even hesitation. This realization produced a calm, reflective horror. There was no immediate dramatic catastrophe, no sudden upheaval of the senses. Instead, the effect was slow, deliberate, and insidious, like a tide gradually reshaping a shoreline. Each participant began to notice subtle changes around them. Objects shifted inexplicably, spaces seemed altered between visits, and traces of events appeared to respond to prior observation in ways that felt deliberate, almost orchestrated. One discovered a letter they had written days before, now rewritten in part, its words subtly altered as if echoing a cognition that had not existed at the time of writing. Another observed a shadow linger in a familiar hallway, perfectly aligned, with a remembered sequence in a recording, yet not originating from any visible source. The world, once predictable, had become responsive. Philosophical reflection became unavoidable. The participants began questioning the nature of causality, the relationship between perception and reality, and the ethics of knowledge that exceeded ordinary comprehension. How much influence should one exercise merely by observing? Was the act of noticing patterns itself an act of participation, shaping reality in quiet but profound ways? The hum seemed to answer in silence, threading through thought and attention, emphasizing consequence without dictating choice. Each participant experienced a growing awareness that observation was not neutral. To learn, to remember, to reflect, was to alter the fabric of experience, threading awareness into a tapestry they could no longer disentangle. The burden of knowing too much became tangible in daily life. Compulsions, hallucinations, and reflections, once private and contemplative, now carried subtle consequences beyond the mind. Misplaced objects, fleeting shadows, altered sequences. In recordings, these were traces of cognition affecting reality. Even interactions with outsiders were tinged with the hum's influence. A misremembered phrase might ripple into an event. A fleeting glance could foreshadow unexplainable alignment, and minor, seemingly trivial actions took on unforeseen weight. Knowledge was no longer a passive observer. It was an active participant, quietly shaping the flow of existence, and the 22 became acutely aware of the moral and psychological responsibility inherent in this awareness. Each participant responded differently to this realization. Some approached it with poetic contemplation, tracing the hum's influence as one might follow a river's currents, aware that their journey was entwined with forces beyond comprehension. Others experienced subtle dread, a quiet, gnawing unease that awareness could not be unlearned, that observation carried consequence, and that the lattice of cognition they had entered was both beautiful and perilous. Even those most accustomed to reflection felt the slow pressure of inevitability. The broadcast had begun to exact a cost for curiosity, a cost that was neither sudden nor dramatic, but measured, precise, and inexorable. The psychological weight was compounded by isolation. While the 22 had long shared a network of letters, recordings, and reflections, the realization that knowledge produced tangible effects created an unspoken distance. Participants were aware of each other's influence upon the lattice of perception, yet could not fully intervene, could not prevent the quiet consequences that emerged. Every observation, every insight became a delicate act, both intimate and perilous, producing ripple effects that extended beyond understanding. The hum, persistent and patient, accentuated the contrast between awareness and consequence, reflection and subtle horror, curiosity and ethical burden. As the section progressed, the calm, reflective tone contrasted with subtle, almost imperceptible horror. Observations that had once felt poetic now carried weight. Hallucinations that had been entertaining became harbingers. Shadows lingered as warnings and sequences in letters, or recordings assumed significance that was uncomfortably literal. A participant might find a journal entry, mirroring a sequence of external events that had not yet occurred, or notice that an innocuous observation had produced minor but cascading effects in the environment. Knowledge was no longer abstract. It had become tangible, inevitable, and quietly transformative, threading the 22 into an unfolding architecture that was both intimate and inescapable. The hum seemed to amplify the tension between revelation and anticipation. Participants experienced sequences and alignments as though reality itself had become a narrative, their attention guided without instruction, their reflection threaded into the architecture of events. Minor hallucinations, faint flickers of light, shapes at the edge of vision, whispers in silence, took on significance beyond the immediately observable, signaling both presence and consequence. Observation, reflection, and cognition became intertwined with reality, producing subtle effects that were imperceptible to outsiders, but profoundly evident to those attuned to the hum. Philosophical meditation deepened. Participants considered the burden of knowledge in historical, ethical, and existential terms. To know too much was to become entangled, to observe was to alter, to remember was to shape, and to reflect was to participate. The hum, insistent yet silent, suggested that the pursuit of insight was inseparable from consequence. Curiosity, long celebrated as a virtue, revealed itself as both gift and liability. Illumination carried weight, comprehension carried responsibility, and the act of learning had irrevocable effects on mind, perception, and the world. These contemplations were quiet, reflective, and deeply unsettling, producing a hypnotic tension that threaded thought with subtle dread. Subtle signs of consequence began to escalate. Participants noticed coincidences with increasing frequency, minor disruptions in ordinary routines, unexplained alignments between personal observation and external events, and unexpected appearances or disappearances of objects, messages, or fragments of thought. These incidents were calm in their presentation, yet unnerving in implication. The realization emerged slowly. Every act of perception, attention, or reflection threaded the 22 further into a network of influence that was not purely psychological but tangible in the world around them. This crescendo of awareness prepared the narrative for a climactic shift. The calm, reflective tone of observation contrasted with the underlying sense of hazard. Knowledge carried cost, and the hum, persistent and patient, ensured that the cost was unavoidable. Participants could not ignore patterns, could not avoid observation, and could not disentangle themselves from consequence. Awareness, insight, and curiosity had become inextricably bound to subtle effects in the world, and the 22 sensed the approach of armament in which consequences would manifest more overtly. The section closed with a quiet, haunting cliffhanger. A few participants vanished without warning, leaving only faint traces. A letter left unfinished, a recording paused. Mid-sentence, a journal entry trailing into ellipsis. The hum persisted, its hypnotic cadence unchanged, as if indifferent to individual absence yet aware of the network it had woven. The remaining 22 confronted the dual realization that knowledge could no longer be contained, and that the next stage, the penultimate convergence of observation, reflection, and consequence, was approaching. Silence had spoken, subtly and inexorably, and the vanishing of some participants marked both the cost of learning too much and the threshold of revelation yet to come. As the hum threaded through consciousness, the remaining participants began to sense an almost imperceptible shift in reality. The pattern of influence that had once seemed gentle, reflective, and contemplative now carried an unmistakable edge. The threshold between observation and consequence had been crossed. Shadows lingered, longer than memory allowed. Sounds echoed with faint dissonance, and the once subtle alignments of perception now suggested impending, inescapable resolution. Each individual became hyper-aware of the surrounding world, noticing details previously dismissed. A door left slightly ajar, a letter that seemed to change between readings, a light that flickered in patterns impossible to attribute to ordinary causes. There was no panic, only that slow, intimate awareness of an approaching vanishing, a pull toward the unknown that could neither be resisted nor fully understood. The first disappearance occurred quietly, almost imperceptibly. One participant had been tracing a sequence of shadows and numbers, their mind immersed in the lattice of connections previously discovered. They paused to write a fragmentary note, a fleeting record of observation, and in the next instant they were gone. The notebook remained, filled with half-formed thoughts, but the presence behind it, the mind, the awareness, the consciousness, had vanished without trace. Those who discovered the absence felt a strange, subtle horror, a reflective dread more profound than alarm. It was as if reality itself had swallowed an individual whole, leaving only echoes and shadows of thought. The remaining participants experienced a heightened intensity of perception in the wake of each disappearance. The hum persisted, hypnotic and patient, threading through observation, memory, and reflection. Shadows moved with a deliberate rhythm, light flickered in calculated sequences, and the familiar environment seemed simultaneously static and alive. Every action, thought, and reflection felt amplified, imbued with significance. A glance toward a window might reveal a figure at the edge of vision, only for it to vanish when directly observed. A letter once thought mundane now seemed laden with meaning. The world itself appeared to respond to attention, reinforcing the slow, immersive tension that accompanied the vanishing of colleagues. Intimate accounts of experience deepened the psychological weight. One participant described walking through a hallway, the air thick with quiet expectation, as if the very atmosphere anticipated the act of disappearance. Their thoughts were fractured, alternating between rational observation and hallucinatory reflection. Numbers traced in a notebook shifted subtly before comprehension could follow. Shadows pooled unnaturally in corners, as if drawing attention or signaling an unseen presence. The mind, attuned to the hum, interpreted every minor anomaly as portent, every sound as an echo of consequence. With each step, the quiet inevitability of vanishing pressed upon awareness, measured and deliberate, like the tide slowly reclaiming land. Another participant recounted the sensation of being observed from every direction simultaneously. Peripheral. Vision seemed heightened, every shadow carrying intent, every reflection bearing significance. Hallucinations and reality merged. A fleeting shape in the doorway mirrored a memory, a whisper in silence recalled a fragment of a letter, and a familiar object appeared altered in subtle but meaningful ways. Each encounter deepened the sense of immersion, creating a hypnotic rhythm of anticipation. The hum threaded through these experiences, ensuring that observation itself became a medium of engagement with forces beyond comprehension, a quiet prelude to disappearance. As more participants vanished, the pattern became increasingly evident. Disappearances were never sudden in the narrative perception of those remaining. They occurred across subtle sequences, almost imperceptibly, each instance threading into a broader lattice of cause and consequence. The remaining participants began to anticipate their own potential, vanishing with reflective calm rather than panic. Awareness became both shield and prison. They could observe, reflect, and record, yet could not alter the inevitability of the hum's influence. Memory, hallucination, and environmental cues formed a continuous feedback loop, reinforcing the slow, immersive tension that defined this stage. The external world, barely aware of the subtle events, remained eerily quiet. No alarms were raised, no disturbances publicly acknowledged. For those outside the network, reality continued its ordinary rhythm, yet the participants sensed an imperceptible alignment. Coincidences, shadows, and anomalies resonated with the hum's orchestration. A streetlight might flicker precisely when a participant recalled a letter. A minor sound outside might echo a previous dream, or an object in a room might move in ways untraceable by conventional observation. These events, subtle yet persistent, reinforced the sense that disappearance was part of a broader architecture of influence, invisible to the ordinary eye, but profoundly tangible to those attuned. Each intimate account revealed the multifaceted psychological consequences of vanishing. One participant described feeling weightless and detached even before the act, a quiet realization that the body, mind, and perception might no longer align with ordinary existence. Another reflected on a sequence of hallucinations merging with observation, the sensation that even memory and thought were being orchestrated, that attention itself was a tool guiding transition. The hum persisted as both, constant and mutable, threading through cognitive perception while allowing observation of the external environment. This duality created an immersive tension, slow, reflective, and hypnotic, in which the participants were acutely aware that every thought and action contributed to the inevitable convergence of disappearance. Letters, recordings, and fragments of reflection became haunting markers of those who vanished. A participant might find a journal entry mid-sentence, a recording paused in reflection, or a letter containing ellipses trailing into silence. These fragments served as poetic signposts, reflecting both presence and absence, thought and erasure. The remaining participants interpreted them cautiously, knowing that each trace contained insight, yet also served as a reminder of inevitable loss. The hum, patient and insistent, ensured that every observation, every engagement with these traces, contributed to the slow-building tension, threading anticipation and quiet dread into awareness. The environment itself seemed to participate in the unfolding phenomenon. Doors closed without cause, light shifted in faint sequences, and minor sounds punctuated the quiet spaces of observation. Even ordinary objects acquired significance. A cup left unattable might mirror a sequence from a dream. A notebook might contain marginalia aligning with recent hallucinations. Shadows moved with subtle deliberation, echoing patterns found in recordings or letters. The hum threaded through all, creating alignment between cognition, perception, and environment, ensuring that the vanishing of participants remained immersive, inevitable, and hypnotically slow. Narrative tension built through alternating perspectives, shifting between intimate internal accounts and the subtle orchestration of the broader phenomenon. One participant's hallucination mirrored the reflection of another. A shadow observed by one corresponded to an object manipulated by another. A fragmentary sound aligned across rooms, separated by distance. The lattice of experience deepened, reinforcing both immersion and suspense. Each step, each glance, each reflection contributed to a heightened awareness that disappearance was not random, but structured, inevitable, and intimately tied to attention itself. By the close of this section, only a handful of the 22 remained, their perception finely attuned to patterns, hallucinations, shadows, and subtle coincidences. The hum persisted, threading through memory, observation, and environment alike, guiding awareness toward the final broadcast. Disappearances had become both poetic and unnerving, an immersive testament to the cost of curiosity and insight. Each remaining participant understood the quiet inevitability of their own potential vanishing, yet moved forward with reflective attention, observing, documenting, and anticipating. The stage was now set for the final transmission. The lattice of vanished individuals, remaining observers, hallucinations, environmental anomalies, and the ever-present hum coalesced into a quiet, hypnotic crescendo. Shadows, letters, recordings, and fragments of cognition aligned subtly, marking the threshold between anticipation and revelation. The remaining participants felt the pull of convergence, the penultimate tension of awareness, consequence, and disappearance had reached its zenith. Every thread, trace, and observation was poised to feed into the final act, the ultimate broadcast that would resolve the patterns, illuminate the connections, and reveal the cost of knowing too much. The hum, persistent and patient, grew perceptibly richer in texture. Though its volume remained gentle, almost imperceptible to the ordinary ear, it resonated in the peripheral awareness of the remaining participants, threading through their thoughts, perceptions and memories, as if consciousness itself had become an instrument tuned to its rhythm. They had long learned to observe with acute attention, noting shadows, reflections, sequences in letters and recordings, the subtle alignments in hallucinations. Yet nothing in prior experience could fully prepare them for the culmination now approaching, the final transmission. It was not heralded by fanfare or alarm, but by a profound, almost sacred stillness, a quiet anticipation that pervaded every movement, every thought, every breath. The 22, or what remained of them, gathered or perhaps merely aligned themselves within the lattice of influence that the hum had slowly constructed over weeks, months, or what might have felt like lifetimes. Space itself seemed to respond to their awareness. Corridors lengthened, shadows stretched and softened, light diffused in gentle patterns that reflected memory, observation, and the invisible threads that connected each mind to the others. Every object, letter, and recording appeared to pulse faintly in rhythm with the hum, as if the physical world had become a resonant echo chamber for consciousness. The participants felt simultaneously grounded and weightless, aware of self and networked perception, a duality that produced hypnotic tension rather than panic. The first wave of the final broadcast unfolded not as sound, but as sensation. A faint vibration threaded through the body, perceptible in heartbeat and breath, subtle yet undeniable. Participants sensed patterns forming in their minds before any external stimulus arrived, sequences of letters, numbers, and symbols imprinted on memory with deliberate clarity, weaving connections across previous hallucinations, dreams, and observations. The hum acted as a medium, orchestrating attention and reflection in synchrony with the broadcast, blending the boundaries of perception and reality. One could not distinguish whether insight emerged spontaneously or was subtly guided. Yet in this liminal space, such distinctions became irrelevant. The transmission carried its revelations in layers, unfolding first in fragments that were poetic, almost lyrical. Letters and words recombined in memory, forming patterns that revealed subtle truths, echoes of vanished participants, alignments between hallucinations and observations, reflections of prior dreams. There was no rush, no imperative to understand. Immediately, the participants experienced each fragment with slow, deliberate attention, savoring the resonance of insight while simultaneously feeling its quiet weight. Knowledge arrived like a tide washing across the mind, calm, inevitable, immersive, and profoundly transformative. Emotional tension swelled subtly, never dramatic but persistent. Participants felt awe, melancholy, wonder, and the quiet sting of loss simultaneously. The vanished, though absent, were present in the lattice of memory, hallucination, and reflection. Fragments of letters, half-heard whispers, and dreams that seemed to align with reality served as reminders that knowledge carried consequence. Each participant felt the hum's insistence, guiding attention, weaving perception, threading thought, and ensuring that every reflection and observation contributed to the unfolding network of awareness. Even as emotional intensity rose, narration within consciousness remained calm, reflective, hypnotic, and measured, like a gentle river carrying all toward its inevitable convergence. The hallucinations and distortions that had long accompanied awareness intensified, yet harmonized with understanding. Shadows at the periphery of vision now formed coherent sequences, letters and recordings aligned with precision, and sequences of events threaded across perception, memory, and observation with lyrical resonance. It was as if the hum and broadcast were revealing an invisible architecture beneath existence, a lattice of causality, consciousness, and reflection that could only be apprehended in fragments, slowly, poetically, and with reflective attention. Each participant sensed the vastness of this structure, the intimacy of its weaving, and the subtle but undeniable influence it exerted on thought, action, and perception. Time became fluid. Moments stretched, overlapped, and echoed across consciousness. A glance out a window might reveal a shadowed figure perfectly mirroring a dream, A letter reread might carry layers of meaning imperceptible upon first reading. A previously trivial sound could reverberate with significance. The hum threaded through these temporal distortions, ensuring that the final broadcast was experienced as both revelation and immersion. Participants understood that each sensation, observation, and reflection was part of the transmission itself, a quiet choreography in which perception, memory, and insight were inseparable from the message being conveyed. The final transmission did not yield simple answers but profound layered understanding. Knowledge was imparted not as direct instruction, but as subtle insight. The cost of curiosity, the intertwining of perception and reality, the inevitability of consequence, and the delicate beauty of observation. One participant might recognize the alignment between hallucinations and vanished colleagues. Another might perceive the architecture connecting sequences of letters, shadows, and environmental anomalies. The emotional experience was high, deeply reflective and immersive, yet narrated calmly in consciousness, like a voice at the edge of perception, guiding without haste, highlighting without imposition. The vanished participants remained a subtle presence in memory and observation. Their absence resonated as part of the transmission, echoes of insight, fragmented letters, and dreams aligned with the present awareness. The hum's orchestration ensured that their influence persisted, threading perception and cognition in ways impossible to separate from the network of remaining participants. Knowledge, as the broadcast revealed, was not confined to individual experience but extended across minds, shadows, and space, leaving a ripple that was simultaneously poetic and haunting. As the final layers of the broadcast unfolded, the remaining 22, or what remained of them, felt the subtle hypnotic pull of convergence. Hallucinations aligned perfectly with prior letters, shadows mirrored sequences of past observation, and fragments of memory threaded seamlessly into reflection. Each participant perceived the depth of connection, the intimacy of the lattice, and the gentle inevitability that insight could not be contained. Knowledge, once learned, became eternal in its influence, extending beyond vanished bodies, observable actions, and the limits of ordinary perception. The emotional intensity reached its quiet peak. Awe, melancholy, wonder, and subtle horror mingled seamlessly. The hum persisted, patient, hypnotic, and unchanging, threading the network of perception while imparting the sense of eternal resonance. Each insight, each alignment, each observation became part of a continuum, a poetic echo extending beyond the immediate experience of the participants. It was as if the broadcast itself existed in multiple dimensions of awareness simultaneously, touching thought, memory, perception, and environment with equal delicacy, leaving behind the sense that understanding, once attained, could never truly fade. As the final sequences of insight passed, ambiguity reigned. The participants could perceive threads connecting vanished individuals, hallucinations, letters, shadows, and environmental patterns, yet the ultimate endpoint remained inscrutable. The hum suggested continuity, a quiet awareness that knowledge once touched would ripple forever, influencing thought, memory, and perception in ways beyond immediate observation. The narrative closed not with finality, but with poetic resonance, a sense that the broadcast, the hum, and the lattice of influence extended beyond disappearance, beyond consciousness, and beyond the boundary of ordinary comprehension. The final transmission ended gently, almost imperceptibly, leaving participants suspended between awareness and reflection, presence and absence, insight and incomprehension. Shadows lingered in peripheral vision, letters remained partially unread, recordings paused mid-sentence, and the hum persisted, patient and eternal. The 22, or the remnants of that group, experienced both closure and continuity simultaneously. Knowledge, once absorbed, had become a permanent ripple across perception and reality, an invisible architecture that could neither be undone nor fully comprehended. They remained aware, reflective, and hypnotically attuned, caught in the eternal. Resonance of what had been learned vanished and revealed. The hum persisted, though faint now, as though the world itself had settled into a quiet rhythm, carrying the echoes of a broadcast that had long since ended. The 22, or the fragments that remained of them, had been dispersed, vanished, or transformed in ways that defied conventional understanding. Yet traces lingered, subtle and enduring, in letters left unfinished, recordings paused mid-thought, and fleeting shadows that aligned inexplicably with memory. The world appeared ordinary to the outside observer, yet to those attuned to the lattice, of influence. Every nuance of perception, every fragment of thought carried resonance from the signal that had once threaded through mind, matter, and environment. Time had slowed, stretched, and folded upon itself, leaving an imprint of insight, loss, and the quiet weight of knowledge. In the aftermath, the vanished existed as absence and presence simultaneously. Letters, journals, and recordings became poetic markers echoing their existence and the subtle influence they had woven into the fabric of perception. Observers could trace the lattice of connections, recognize patterns aligning across minds, and sense the deliberate orchestration of attention that had long guided reflection, hallucination, and observation. The hum lingered in memory and in the quiet spaces of thought, reminding those who remained that knowledge, once acquired, could never truly be forgotten or contained. The vanished had become more than physical absence. They were threads woven into the larger tapestry of awareness, their influence extending across perception and reality like ripples upon an invisible pond. Philosophical reflection deepened in the stillness. Knowledge, they realized, was both gift and burden, illumination and hazard. To learn was to touch the infinite lattice of connection, to recognize alignment in coincidences and hallucinations, and to perceive sequences in the otherwise mundane. Yet with insight came responsibility and cost. The vanished were proof that curiosity could exact an irrevocable toll, that observation could transform reality subtly but decisively, and that attention itself was no longer neutral. The participants, or those who remained aware, understood the delicate equilibrium between comprehension and consequence, the fragile balance that defined the boundary between perception and disappearance, insight and loss. Memory became both sanctuary and weight. Participants revisited fragments of letters, recordings, and journals with quiet reverence, recognizing that each detail, each symbol, carried both meaning and resonance. Shadows glimpsed at the edge of vision recalled sequences of hallucinations. Words previously overlooked gained significance. Minor coincidences echoed the invisible paths that had connected all 22. Reflection, in this sense, became a contemplative act, a meditation on what had been learned, lost, and transformed. Knowledge was eternal in its influence, an invisible network of awareness threading past, present, and perhaps future, leaving the survivors in a state of quiet, hypnotic contemplation. The world itself seemed altered in subtle ways. Ordinary streets, buildings, and rooms bore traces of the lattice without betraying the events to the uninitiated. A streetlight flickered in rhythm with a remembered sequence. Shadows pooled in familiar corners, echoing alignments previously observed. Letters and recordings carried faint anomalies perceptible only to those attuned to prior patterns. These small ripples reinforced the philosophical truth that knowledge leaves an imprint beyond comprehension. The vanished had altered the landscape of perception itself, creating a quiet network of influence that persisted, tangible yet hidden, and in doing so had left a legacy both haunting and beautiful. Their reflective tone extended to the emotional dimension. Awe and melancholy mingled with subtle dread, producing a hypnotic equilibrium of sensation and understanding. The participants or remaining observers were aware of the profound intimacy of absence, the quiet resonance of vanished minds, and the delicate web of consequence threaded through perception. Curiosity, the engine that had driven them toward the signal, was now revealed in all its complexity. It was a force of illumination, revelation and expansion, yet also a subtle agent of risk, transformation, and irrevocable change. The gift of knowledge carried a cost, measured not in drama but in the gentle erosion of certainty and the haunting presence of absence. Letters and recordings continued to serve as conduits of reflection. Fragments of thought, incomplete sequences, and poetic observations became more than documentation. They were living echoes, resonating across cognition and perception. Observers discovered alignments between letters long forgotten, hallucinations once thought private, and sequences that had threaded multiple minds. These echoes suggested that the lattice of influence, the hum and the vanished individuals, had left an enduring trace upon the world, perceptible only to those willing to attend to its subtle cadence. Knowledge, once obtained, had become permanent, rippling outward in imperceptible yet eternal waves. The disappeared had not been obliterated, but transformed, their influence persisting in quiet, almost imperceptible ways. Participants reflected on this ambiguity. Absence and presence coexisted, the vanished subtly shaping observation and memory, threading thought, hallucination, and reflection into a continuous lattice. In this state, philosophical questions arose. Naturally, what is the nature of existence when knowledge transcends physical presence? How does one measure consequence when perception itself becomes medium? Can human curiosity ever be contained, or is it inherently expansive, touching everything it encounters in ways both poetic and dangerous? These questions remained unresolved, haunting, and beautiful, leaving survivors suspended in contemplative reverie. The hum itself, though quieter, persisted as a subtle reminder. It threaded through memory, attention, and observation, binding the past to the present and suggesting continuity beyond ordinary understanding. Awareness, insight, and reflection were revealed as enduring forces. Even in the absence of physical presence, consciousness had left imprints upon perception, environment, and cognition. The lattice of knowledge, observation, and consequence remained intact, patient, and eternal, reminding those attuned that human curiosity, once awakened, never truly disappears. Each shadow, letter, recording, and hallucination became a node in this invisible architecture, a testament to the enduring resonance of insight. Even as narrative tension eased, philosophical meditation deepened. The participants recognized the duality of curiosity, a force that inspired, illuminated, and connected, yet also one that exacted subtle, permanent costs. Knowledge was a bridge, linking perception, memory, and reality in ways that could never be fully disentangled. Those who had vanished left traces that were simultaneously beautiful and haunting, poetic and disquieting. The hum, patient and persistent, seemed to whisper that learning and observation, once intertwined with awareness, extend beyond the immediate, leaving a legacy invisible yet indelible. In the quiet aftermath, participants observed that the world itself had been subtly reshaped. Ordinary streets, letters, and rooms bore imperceptible imprints of vanished minds, sequences, and hallucinations. Even the uninitiated might sense in fleeting moments echoes of pattern or alignment, though they could not comprehend the source. The lattice persisted, extending invisibly across perception and memory, a quiet monument to the influence of knowledge, curiosity, and attentive observation. The gift of understanding remained intertwined with the cost of insight, threading existence with both wonder and unease. The final reflection was both intimate and universal. Knowledge, once grasped, could not be fully contained or forgotten. Curiosity, the force that had drawn the 22 into the signal, had produced both illumination and loss, awe and melancholy, understanding and subtle horror. The vanished persisted in memory, perception, and environment, their influence echoing in letters, recordings, shadows, and sequences. Observers were left to contemplate the delicate balance between comprehension and consequence, reflection and absence, curiosity and legacy. The narrative concluded with quiet ambiguity. The hum, though now faint, suggested continuity. The broadcast had ended, yet its influence rippled eternally. The lattice of awareness, memory, and perception extended beyond vanished individuals, beyond the immediate experience of those remaining, and perhaps even beyond ordinary comprehension. Knowledge, curiosity, and reflection persisted as an enduring echo, a poetic and haunting reminder of the subtle, transformative, and eternal nature of understanding. The audience was left with lingering questions. How far does human curiosity reach, Can knowledge ever truly be contained? And what traces of awareness persist long after those who possessed it are gone? In the stillness that followed, there was both closure and continuation. The vanished were gone, yet present. The hum lingered, and the lattice of insight, memory, and consequence extended into spaces beyond ordinary perception. Curiosity had unfolded its infinite paths, leaving subtle, haunting, and indelible traces upon the world. The signal had ended, but its echo remained, eternal and reflective, a gentle, poetic reminder that knowledge once touched leaves a resonance that can never be erased. The static lingered, soft and unrelenting, like the final exhale of a long-forgotten conversation. In its subtle rhythm, the echoes of the vanished persisted, threading memory, perception, and imagination into a lattice that neither began nor ended. The 22, or the remnants that remained, had long since passed through the stages of wonder, curiosity, fear, and melancholy, leaving behind only traces, fragments of letters, half-heard whispers in recordings, and fleeting glimpses of shadows that seemed alive with meaning. Each trace carried resonance, a testament to the intricate web of cause and consequence woven by the broadcast, the hum, and the attention of those who had listened too closely. In the quiet aftermath, the emotional landscape of those who remained, or those who merely observed the echoes, was a mixture of awe, loss, and contemplative unease. Curiosity, once celebrated as a virtue, revealed its dual nature with undeniable clarity. It inspired exploration, insight, and connection, yet carried subtle, irreversible cost. The vanished embodied this paradox. Their absence was proof of danger, their influence evidence of permanence. Knowledge, once grasped, could not be unlearned, nor could the ripples it created be contained. Observers realized that to seek, to notice, to reflect, was to participate in a network of consequences extending beyond the immediacy of time and place. Each act of perception, each alignment of attention with the hum or the broadcast, had threaded consciousness into an invisible architecture, fragile yet enduring, quiet yet profound. The tension between fear and wonder remained central. The vanished produced both emotional gravity and poetic resonance. Fear arose from absence, from the inexorable consequences of knowledge that exceeded ordinary comprehension, and from the awareness that curiosity could exact a personal toll invisible to the outside world. Wonder persisted in the delicate alignment of hallucinations, letters, recordings, and environmental coincidences, the intricate lattice of perception that had been revealed by the hum. These dualities were inseparable. Insight brought joy, and revelation yet carried the shadow of cost, a haunting reminder that illumination was rarely free. The observers lingered in this emotional liminality, suspended between understanding and dread, curiosity and caution. Reflection deepened on the nature of knowledge itself. It was not merely information to be collected or secrets to be unlocked, but a living force, subtle yet transformative, threading perception, cognition, and environment into patterns beyond ordinary comprehension. The vanished were not gone entirely. They persisted as influence, memory, and trace, reminders that learning and observation create eternal ripples. The quiet aftermath was neither relief nor closure in the conventional sense, but a meditation on the profound interplay between human awareness and the invisible currents that shape reality. Knowledge, when touched, becomes both guide and warning, a gentle and persistent presence that cannot be ignored. Philosophical questions arose naturally in the stillness. How far does curiosity reach? Can forbidden knowledge ever truly be contained? What traces remain once the seekers vanish, and what echoes linger in memory, perception, and reality? Each participant, or each attuned observer, grasped that the boundaries between observer and observed had dissolved. The hum, subtle yet insistent, suggested that attention itself carries weight. The act of noticing, of thinking, of recording or reflecting contributes to the continuum of consequence. The final broadcast, though ended, continued to resonate, a reminder that some truths, once glimpsed, extend eternally beyond the comprehension or control of those who first encountered them. The quiet carried emotional texture. Loss was felt in the absence of colleagues and friends, in the traces left behind, and in the awareness that curiosity could lead to irrevocable separation. Insight, however, endured as both consolation and revelation. Observers understood patterns invisible to outsiders, glimpsed harmonies between memory, hallucination, and reality, and recognized the subtle architecture of causality threaded through the vanished, the hum, and the broadcast. The emotional contrasts, fear and wonder, grief and fascination, despair and poetic reflection, created a slow, immersive cadence that lingered in consciousness, gentle yet persistent, echoing the hypnotic tone of the original transmission. Time itself seemed suspended in the reflective aftermath. Ordinary days resumed for those outside the network, yet those attuned felt the subtle distortions that lingered in perception. Letters realigned themselves, shadows mirrored memory, and minor coincidences unfolded with the resonance of prior observation. Awareness had become intertwined with consequence, and every act of reflection carried significance. The quiet, slow cadence of the hum reminded observers that curiosity, once awakened, does not fade. It threads the unseen, leaves ripples across consciousness, and ensures that knowledge is never fully contained. Even absence, even disappearance, carries influence, echoing in patterns perceptible only to those willing to observe with patience and attention. Ultimately, the conclusion is quiet, reflective, and slightly unsettling. Knowledge is beautiful, illuminating, and intoxicating, yet it carries the shadow of cost, the subtle weight of consequence, and the haunting resonance of absence. The 22, through their vanishing, their insight, and their enduring influence, demonstrated both the power and peril of curiosity. Observers are left in a liminal state, aware of insight and its danger, understanding and its cost, beauty and its melancholy. The calm persists not because resolution is achieved, but because the narrative itself has woven a persistent, poetic architecture of attention, memory, and reflection, allowing the mind to dwell gently on consequence and resonance. The final static of the broadcast fades into silence, soft and rhythmic, like the heartbeat of a long-forgotten signal. Shadows remain, letters linger, and fragments of memory carry the imprint of vanished minds. The hum, though dissipated, echoes faintly in perception, a reminder that the pursuit of understanding, the act of observing, and the touch of forbidden knowledge leaves traces that extend beyond the immediate. Curiosity once awakened is eternal in its influence. Knowledge once touched is immortal in its subtle ripples. The audience is left with calm reflection, immersed in the quiet interplay between wonder and fear, absence and presence, insight and loss. In this stillness, the story reaches its meditative close. Emotional contrasts, the weight of what was lost and the beauty of what was gained, linger. Philosophical questions, unanswered yet persistent, hover in the mind. How far does human curiosity reach? What is the cost of learning too much? And when knowledge outlasts its seekers, what echoes remain in the world they leave behind? The answer, like the hum itself, is subtle, eternal, and poetic. Knowledge carries its own quiet resonance, and in its echoes, we sense both the gift and the curse of curiosity, the gentle legacy of those who learn too much, and the enduring silence that follows.